Where does that come from, by the way? I mean, is it just me, or does it happen to other people? As soon as I mention the U.S. state of Mississippi, for some reason my internal monologue goes MISSISSIPPI. Where does that come from? I can't even remember where that comes from. What, it's not? Is it Tom Sawyer? Why, it's the strangest thing. It's like a sort of Pavlov's dog reaction. I assume whenever I come across, in any context whatsoever, the word Mississippi, M-I-double-S, just went again, MISSISSIPPI. Well, it must come from somewhere. I've got absolutely no idea. The reason why Mississippi, MISSISSIPPI, is interesting in the context of this astonishing number crunching in the Financial Times today. It's because I think it's the poorest state in America, and we would be poorer than them per head if it wasn't for London. Now, obviously, this is not quite as epic or as sweeping as it initially appears, because all economies are diverse and disparate. So, you know, to separate, every economy in the world is going to have a nucleus. Do you see what I mean? An engine room. So any country, whether it's state or any state, whether it's a part of a federation like American states, or whether it's a nation like the UK, it's going to have an engine room. There are going to be bits of it that are driving the economy and bits of it that are being driven. But goodness me, that is an astonishing statistic. John Byrne Murdoch, by the way, I think he's been on the programme, but I don't think I've met him face to face. He is probably my favourite journalist working in Britain today. It's been of enormous help to me working on my new book. Some of the graphs and the number crunching that he's done, and of course the what would you call it? It's almost like the soothing balm of genuine objectivity. And I know this is a classic case of pot kettle, but when you look at the media, everything's a fight these days. I know, pot kettle. But it is, isn't it? It's all so noisy. And then you come across journalism, and the FT is brilliant for this. That is, you know, it has great opinion writers, opinion pieces. But the news pages are utterly independent, as many news pages used to be. Would you believe when my late father was on the Daily Telegraph, you could rely on the Daily Telegraph for relatively unbiased coverage of most issues, maybe not Northern Ireland, but most issues. Back in these days, you just can't. Where are you going to go? But the FT's work in journalism, and John Byrne Murdoch's journalism in particular, should be taught in every school in the country. And looking at this figure, these per capita figures, they're just stunning. We would be, well, without London, the UK would be poorer per head than Mississippi. It comes from Annie, I think. That seems to be the general consensus, but I didn't necessarily, or is it Forrest Gump? Oh, of course, my inbox, I've done it again. I've got to stop doing these slightly whimsical flights of fancy at the top of the programme, because it kills my inbox dead for at least 20 minutes. I'm just going to get loads and loads of messages now, and I'm going to forget what the Bobby Gentry, apparently. But, or Forrest Gump, or there's I don't know. Anyway, it'll come to me at some point. Probably at about 1:10 on my way home after the show. I'll remember why. Whenever I see the word Mississippi, I hear in my head M-I-S-S. I think it's Annie. Alex knows this in Brackley, because she played Annie at school 33 years ago. I presume that's a female Alex. You never know. I went to an all-boys school, and I don't think they would have chosen Annie as the school play for obvious reasons. But Alex is one of those names. You can never be 100% sure. 7 minutes after 10 is the time. So that's story number one. Britain would be poorer than Mississippi per head if we didn't have London. Now, what has that got to do with Woolworths in Kidderminster, which closed at the same time that all the other Woolworths in the country closed? And it has been reported this very week in the Kidderminster Shuttle and elsewhere that they are going to build a park on the site of the old Woolworths. It has had nothing in it since Woolworths closed. What year did Woolworths close? Off the top of your head? I think you're looking at about 97. No, later. Later than that. When was I doing the Right Stuff in Norwich? Can anyone remember? So it was about 20 years ago. We're at 2023, 2003. I'd say about 2001, 2, 4. We'll find out. Apparently, there's this thing called Google. Sometimes I think when I do this stuff on air, my colleagues don't realise that I'm saying, could you possibly, without having to break the spell of my broadcasting. What I'm actually doing is saying to my colleagues, can you just check that for me while I speak? And they respond by just sort of pulling faces and shaking their heads and going, oh no, higher, higher, like sort of little Bruce Forsyth. Lower, lower, higher, higher. Could you look it up and tell me? Would that be above and beyond the call of duty? I don't know. 8 minutes after 10. So it has had nothing on the site since Woolworths shut. Which, in the context of towns outside London, you can see why I've brought the Financial Times into this. 2009, that was when the last 199 stores went in 2000. No, I'm thinking before that, aren't I? Because I thought... Anyway, 2009, farewell Woolworths. It's been empty ever since. Now, in many towns, and I think this is relevant to the outside London issue, in many towns... that is normal. The place shut and it never opened again. And Woolworths would always have been in prime real estate, as the Americans would say. Woolworths would have been, situated in a town, a medium-sized town, on precisely the thoroughfare where there was likely to be the most traffic, the most foot traffic. So you're looking at Marks and Spencer's, aren't you? Probably in the same corner of town, if not necessarily on the same street. Back in the day, you'd have had a Littlewoods there. And then a record shop, you'd have had an Art Price or a Virgin Records or something like that. And you'd have had lots of destination shops. And then it shut, and then it went. And nothing came back. And I don't know why. I go a bit John Betjeman when it comes to towns. It's because I grew up in one. You grow up in a town like Kidderminster, a small to medium-sized town, and it gets into your bones. It gets into your blood. And then you move to London, or rather I moved to London, and I completely forget how different it is. So, for example, when Woolworths shut on Chiswick High Road, which is sort of near where I live now, it didn't stay shut for long. I think it turned into Carluccio's, ironically enough, and then when Carluccio's shut, it turned into a Pret-a-Manger, which is currently there now, and it stays shut for a bit, but it doesn't stay shut for long. Which means, I think, that if you... And the same would hold true if you go out into... I'm a West Londoner, so you go out into Acton or Ealing, or you head a little bit further west. And then when you get further out, the further out of town you get, the more likely you are to encounter boarded-up shops on high streets. Post-lockdown, Leicester Square had a wobble, which I found fascinating. The idea that the single most... what's the word I'm looking for? It's not quite lucrative, is it? Because you've got Belgravia and Mayfair and places like that. But Leicester Square, there's probably the single most popular destination in London for tourists, had what had been restaurants still standing empty for a surprisingly long time coming out of lockdown. I'm a bit of an anorak on this stuff. You know I am, because I've been talking to you about it for years. You remember how confused I was about how a pub right on the edge of Leicester Square could stand empty for 15 years. All the time I've worked in this building, there was an empty pub. And then I realised that the owner of it was just sitting tight until someone wanted to build a hotel, and then they could sell it for absolute jackpots. They don't need to open a pub. But I digress. And now those restaurants are finally turning. The ones that I couldn't believe had stayed shut after lockdown are now being done up, 3 in a row actually, all being developed. Everything is open. And I think that's really relevant. I think this is a phone-in that almost excludes London. And I've never quite clocked that before. What is the phone-in? I'm not quite sure yet. You know how this programme works. But 1 in 7 shops now lie empty. In the past 5 years, 6,000 shops have shut. Big news yesterday, of course, was that Wilko has gone under, or almost certainly, or is going under, with the potential loss of 12,000 jobs. And Wilko, like Woolworths, is both a staple of the high street and probably something that doesn't resonate with Londoners. It doesn't resonate in London. And that's relevant to this conversation. So I've hesitated doing this. My background pre-show, and in the second hour we'll talk a little bit about how hard it is to not see the world through the lens of your own experience, even if your experience is 30 years out of date. But my pre-show working life was retail. I worked in retail in Worcester and I worked in retail in London, and I love retail. But I heard callers to Nick this morning talking about Oxford Street quite accurately. I'm an adopted Londoner now, so I get protective. Someone slags off London, I feel my heckles rise. But Oxford Street's an absolute. It's a disgrace, frankly. Oxford Street. Some sort of stories about money laundering possibly being behind a lot of these weird sweet shops that have sprung up over the years. But Oxford Street is absolutely, I mean, it is a disgrace. It's got one or two absolutely amazing shops on it, and it's got an awful lot of rubbish. But for Londoners, the idea of a high street dying and then completely changing the nature of a town is impossible to grasp. And the same, I think, is true in probably Edinburgh and maybe not Manchester and Birmingham, actually. You know, the shift there has changed as well. And it's all about footfall. It's all about people and whether or not they've got money to spend. So I have hesitated to ask this question. And I ask it in part because the old Woolworths site in Kidderminster is about to be changed into a park. I've seen the artist's impressions. It looks lovely. I don't know what it does. It seems to me to suggest that the whole thinking there is changing. And Kidderminster won't be unique. It won't be alone. The idea that you are in charge of a town and your job is to, well, we've got to get more people in to go shopping, then are you going to build a park? Or is it evidence of the very nature of a town centre changing? The notion of a town centre, here's a question that is going to divide everybody listening into urbanites and everybody else, quite possibly Londoners and everybody else. If I say to you, is the town centre dead? Is it possible that millions of people, well, obviously not millions, we've only got 1.4, but hundreds of thousands of people listening are going to think, oh, come on, James, that happened years ago. It's the concept of a high street or a town centre actually alien to most of this country now. And therefore, when a shop like Wilko closes, it garners the levels of attention it garners because these are nails in the coffin of a concept that once seemed absolutely intrinsic to our communities and our daily lives. I mean, absolutely intrinsic. But the high street or the town centre, whichever you prefer, is now an anachronism. And the shops that have survived are like barnacles upon the hull of a sinking ship. They're not the future. They are harbingers of the past that will slowly fade. Everything will go. We usually mention WH Smiths at this point in the conversation, but I think their business model is sustained by their presence in airports and railway stations, isn't it? So the fact that your local WH Smith almost certainly feels like some sort of 1970s throwback is a little bit anomalous. So, I mean, that's question one, obviously. Once you get out of London, I haven't thought of a more provocative way yet to do the conversation about how the UK would be poorer per head than Mississippi if it wasn't for London. But we'll keep that on simmer. All right, so we'll put that on simmer because I think this is a question you're going to answer very, very differently according to where you live. Is the high street, is the town centre dead? Is Wilko, rather than evidence of an unfolding tragedy, the Wilko closure is actually evidence of an inexorable decline. It's not a sort of flash in the pan or an exception that proves the rule or a retail experience swimming against the general tide. The concept of a town centre or a high street is dead, has been for a while. But because, and here's why the other story's still on simmer, but because so much power and wealth is concentrated in London, because politicians all live in London, even if they spend some time in their constituency, because Parliament is in London, because London is the lens through which almost all of the media looks at the United Kingdom, an utterly ridiculous lens when you think about it, totally distorting. I can sit here in London with a moderately popular radio show on national radio and ask a question that is defined entirely by the fact that I've lived here for 30 odd years. And in fact, when I go home, when I go back to my mum's in Kidderminster, the idea of having a conversation about whether the high street is under threat or whether the town centre is under threat is objectively ridiculous because it died years ago. All you've got now is the sort of twitches when they stick the defibrillator on the chest of a town and it starts twitching. The death throes, if you like. They might last for decades. But I can't see any future. And what are we going to do about it? I'm going to tell you two things now. Don't phone me about parking tickets, all right? That's and about traffic controlling measures. That's not of interest to me. I apologise. That's me being selective, but I'm interested in the bigger issue. I'm interested in the bigger question of whether or not it's actually very, very London-centric, even to wonder about high streets and town centres. The shop as we know it is dead. 0345 6060 973. So then we will have a little look at what's going to happen. And I want to know what has happened already. If Wyre Forest District Council can be visionary by sticking a beautiful park where Woolworths used to be, and you've got to be optimistic, then other councils can be as well. So if you're in retail, ring up and shout at me, by all means, because you may reject utterly the idea that you are on a death spiral, an irrevocable, irreversible death spiral. I hope you're not. I just found myself looking at that London statistic and thinking, good God, that's why these stories land so differently, depending on where you are. So farewell, Wilko. Farewell, 6,000 shops in Britain over the past 5 years. Hello, news that we'd be poorer than Mississippi if it wasn't for London. And give me a call and tell me, is it actually naive, ridiculous, daft to even talk about town centres and high streets in your part of the country? 0345 6060 973. And then we can start looking at what the future might look like. It is 22 minutes after 10 and you are listening to James OBrien on LBC. We'll find a way of doing it one day, Hannah. She said, I went to university in Newcastle. I was constantly told by my northern flatmates that it was so London to refer to a high street. You don't mention when that was, but it wouldn't be the first time I found myself limping along horribly behind the curve. It's the first time it's occurred to me that all the phone-ins we've had over the years about high streets and shops, usually when something like Wilko goes under, have been distorted by the fact that if you live in London, you're looking at a completely different universe from the one you see out of your window if you're not. Ellie's in Leyland. Ellie, what would you like to say?
Well, I do believe that the high street's dead, but when I go shopping, I'm in my 70s and I enjoy going a walk out.
Yes.
But I did find that I walked far more miles going into the local shopping centre, the main shopping centre in Preston. And I used to walk far more miles. When I got back and I checked how many miles I'd walked, and I'd just been sauntering round shops.
But that's nice, isn't it?
That is lovely. I used to love it. But nowadays, you can only buy so many mobile phones, and there are loads of... Every shop is either a mobile phone shop or a Holland and Barrett, and I've got enough Keep Fit stuff, and You've
got enough quinoa coming out. Got quinoa exactly. Coming out of your ears. You don't need any more.
And I can't. There are no other. There don't seem to be any other shops. It's either.
So you're talking about shopping as an activity, aren't you, rather than as a?
Yes. In fairness, I am. If I want anything, I can get it locally.
Yes.
And I mean, forgive me, but I do quite a bit of shopping online, which I'm sure a lot of people do.
I have to forgive you for that. It's absolutely normal now and endemic. What happens then? I don't know, Preston, but what?
Well, I believe that the little local markets are going to make a resurgence.
Do you?
I go round, yeah, I do, because I go round my local market and we've got an excellent butcher, an excellent fishmonger, and if I go on the high street, I don't see that.
But you're paying more.
If I go for meat,
you're not.
It's the supermarket.
Because their overheads will be a bit lower then if they're in the market. Because
exactly.
I was going to say they're going to be more expensive than Aldi and Lidl, but not necessarily.
Well, no, they're not. This is why I say I think that they'll be the future, because the local butcher on Leyland Market and the fishmonger, they are absolute. And we have an excellent cheese stall and cake stall, and they really are good, and they are not expensive.
And is that?
And I think.
Is that a self-contained market in the old place where it used to be, or is it stalls that have sprung up in areas where the shops used to be?
No, it's a self-contained indoor market.
Right, because they're quite rare.
Unfortunately, it's only open for a few days a week, which is very unfortunate. But, I mean, there are like little stalls outside as well sometimes, but I don't know. I find it's so sad.
Small. Yeah, well, it is very sad, and it is hard to put into words, and that's why we're trying together today, both of us, to sort of edge our way towards the light. It is, but also, speaking to me from Lancashire, you're way ahead of me in London because it is two different countries. The high streets where I live will, if a shop goes under, they'll be replaced very, very quickly. Whereas in places like Preston and Kidderminster, when a shop goes under, it may never be replaced at all. Go back to 2008, 2007 for Woolworths. 16 years later. In Kidderminster, they're knocking it down and building a park. Nisha it doesn't say where she is. Well, it doesn't matter. What would you like to say, Nisha?
Hello, hi there.
Hello.
I'm actually an employer. I work for Wilco.
Okay.
At the moment, and I've been there 9 years. For the past 2 years, I have seen business going down. Like hardly people coming in. They find cheaper stuff somewhere else, so they will actually come in, check our prices, and tell us on our faces that so and so's got it cheaper. I'm going there. It's not surprising when it all came out. We weren't actually surprised.
You could see the writing on the wall, as it were.
Oh, definitely. Yeah, and I'm in quite a big store. It's 2 floors.
Yeah.
But where I am, the area is run down.
So it was like a sort of one of the last outposts.
Definitely.
That's what I mean about the street. This being a harbinger of the whole street going under, not just a shop. It's one of the only places left.
So people don't want to actually come into our town to just come to Wilco's because there's nothing else there for them to come
so
for.
It's not, I mean, this, because we could have, if we were a bit more boring, we'd have had a conversation about whether it was down to bad management or something else. Actually, it just feels like almost an inevitable decline. It's almost like a lifespan nearing its end because the environment in which the shop operates is changing and the shop can't. The shop can't change.
Once upon a time, there used to be we're the only ones that do certain things, but now everyone's doing those things, so no one really needs to use a Wilko.
That's what happened to Woolies, I think. That's what happened to Woolworths previously.
Exactly.
It ceased to be a niche. Are you worried? You must be worried.
Yeah, worried. I think some of us needed that little push to get out.
Yeah.
Because we were just like comfortable. But there are older women there that know that cannot get jobs anywhere else, and they're actually quite. They're in a bad way.
Yeah, I'm sure they are.
Yeah.
I'm sure they are. Well, I mean, look out for each other, but there is not a great deal you can do. Thank you, Nisha, and I know you were careful not to give away which branch you were in, which I completely respect. Hunt says, this is an area I'm highly qualified to comment on. I'm currently designing a new rural town high street, and I think you're wrong about high streets elsewhere in the country. Many are adapting and repurposing with an emphasis on dwell time and convenience rather than retail. I think perhaps you misunderstand me because an emphasis, I don't know what dwell time is. I have to apologise. Does that mean how long you stay somewhere? But I'm kind of saying they're ceasing to be focused on retail. That's what I mean by dying as retail hubs, as high streets and town centres in the conventional sense of the word. We're coming to the end of the rainbow. They're obviously not going to disappear. You can't, it's a place. There's going to be something there, but it's not going to be a town centre or a high street in the conventional understanding of those phrases. It's coming up to 10:30. You are listening to James OBrien on LBC. Looking also at that story yesterday about an entire generation of people who won't be able to afford to buy a house. That's the one that I have to, again, I have to recognise. I look at that story through the eyes of 25-year-old me. And 25-year-old me does not live in the same world that 25-year-old you currently lives in. This is another example of how important it is. It's why my job never gets boring. If I was looking at the stories in the same way today that I looked at them 20 years ago, I don't know how I'd get out of bed every morning. This is the same. I'm suddenly realising that a conversation about the high street or the town centre for someone who's lived in London for 30 years is a completely unrecognisable conversation to someone who hasn't. But I haven't come up with a way of having a phone in about the news that without London, Britain would be poorer per head than Mississippi. I'm going to invite you to do that. We could possibly do it on Monday. How would that make a brilliant phone in? That staggering statistic that without London, Britain per head would be poorer than the poorest state in America. I don't know, but text me or tweet me with a suggestion of how we could make that one sing. It's 10:30 and Thomas Watts is here now with your headlines. I'm just worried now. I've jinxed this blooming park in Kidderminster. I'll go there in a couple of years, and it'll be sort of full of, I don't know, marauding utes or sort of feckless gentlemen of the road. I don't know, but that's got to be the future, hasn't it? You cannot There's never going to be a resurrection of the British High Street. It's never going to come back as what it was. So it doesn't have to be worse. This is the crucial point. I was so struck. It was so lovely, actually. It's one of the many reasons why it'll be a while, I think, before Twitter goes under, because it's going to take a long time for anyone else to catch up. But a few people sent me the artist's impression of the park that's going to replace Woolworths in Kidderminster, and it was really nice. And there was people, we were a bit excited about it. It's going to be lovely, but it's not going to be anything like what it was. So it's not like, what can go where Woolworths was? What can go where Wilko was? Whereas in London, as I said, when Carluccio's shut down, they replaced it with a pret-a-manger. So I don't know what the future of the high street looks like, but I don't want to think, and I don't want you to think that I'm suggesting it's going to look worse than it does now. It's just not going to be a retail experience. So now you've got parks and markets. I know a market is a retail experience, but it's not shops. I just find it all very interesting. Emma's in Canterbury. Emma, what would you like to say?
I think you're absolutely wrong, James.
Thank goodness for that. It's the first time for everything, Emma.
About the death of retail and that a high street will no longer be about shops.
Yes.
I think you're right. There will be maybe not a resurrection, as you said, but an evolution. So there will always need to be shops because they're a strong part of a community. So I think I can speak on both sides of this argument because I've had a shop for 15 years in a small town. So when the shop first opened, the town was fairly quiet. We'd had a mining community, obviously that closed. We had the Royal Marines, this is Deal in Kent by the sea. They left and the town was looking, I'm just trying to think how to describe it, a little sad maybe.
A little frayed around the edges.
A little frayed around the edges, and I opened a shop in 2008 right bang in the middle of a recession. So
what were you selling?
I sell women's clothes.
Okay.
So 15 years on, and Deal now, for various reasons, has had an influx of people who've bought houses sort of for weekend homes down from London. During lockdown, they realised that maybe they could do a lot of their work from home. So the town has had a real regeneration.
Oh, that's interesting. But it's also become a London outpost, so it doesn't necessarily defy my analysis. It's just like a sort of a little pocket. It's like the Falkland Islands. It's a little pocket of London in the middle of somewhere else. And I'm not suggesting that shops are dead. I'm suggesting that the high street as we know it, with the massive stores on it, is dead. So my mum had a little dress shop in Kidderminster once. I don't know if you knew that. So I know, there's always going to be room for a really nice, personal, almost boutique level service. But the heavy hitters of our childhood, they're never coming back.
No, and would we necessarily want them to come back?
No, not necessarily. I think it's really healthy to guard against that sort of... I'm a great fan. There's a wonderful Facebook page about Kidderminster, and the chap that runs it is a lovely bloke, and he gets really impatient with the good old days type posts, and you sort of think like rickets and scurvy. And the architecture was a lot nicer before they tore it all down and threw up concrete shops. But if you go down that road, you never get off it, do you? You'll be there forever, just good old daysing.
Absolutely. I mean, I think what everyone has done where we are, and also what's happening successfully around the country, is COVID taught us to pivot. And so things that would have worked pre-lockdown don't now. And lots of small shops who had no online presence built a website using some of their grants.
Yes.
And that's also helped them to sort of diversify. So the other thing to say, of course, is if you want shops to remain and if you want a hub of a community, you've got to use them.
Yeah, I know. I always think of my friend Andreas at this point, who now has an absolutely beautiful new store in Chelsea Green. But when he shut down in Chiswick, everyone came in to commiserate with him and say how much they were going to miss him. And he had to bite his tongue not to say, I see you walking past with your Sainsbury's bags, everything. The only thing you bought from me in the last 5 years was mistletoe last Christmas. So we all think we want these shops, but you're absolutely right to remind us that words are cheap. Custom is what pays the bills and makes the difference. Thank you. Emma, is your shop still open in Deal?
One more thing.
No, hang on. I haven't got time for one more thing. What do you think this is? The Emma in Canterbury show. What's your shop called? Do you want to mention
It's called Tamarisk.
Oh, how lovely. Tamarisk in Deal.
Yes.
Get yourself down there. Get yourself down there for some new clobber. 10:38 is the time. Dave makes a point, which I probably should have picked up. He says the only people surprised by news that the Mississippi But the Mississippi statistic, are people who live in London and the southeast. I thought it might be the other way around because I'm a dork. Sorry. The media being so heavily concentrated in London does no favours to the rest of the country. You're not wrong, mate, about that. I don't know what we can do about it. I can't patronise you by doing a show from Manchester one day. It's a strange state of affairs. But yeah, you're probably right. I was thinking everyone outside London's going to be stunned by this statistic. But actually, you're probably right. It's exactly the other way around. What's that you say? Without London, Britain per head would be poorer than Mississippi. That's absolutely shocking. And then if you're living somewhere where looking around makes it quite easy to believe that per capita we're poorer than Mississippi, you're going to be less shocked. Thank you, Dave. That was a helpful corrective. Sean's in Maidenhead. Sean, what would you like to say?
Hello, James.
Hello, Sean.
Well, I work as a retail recruitment consultant and have done since 1990.
Gosh.
I used to recruit for Wilkinsons,
yes,
as they used to be called. So I just thought I could add a little bit in terms of their demise and maybe give you a bit of a view of the retail market more generally. Wilco's did have some great values. They were family-owned business, still are, and they had some really good values and they had a really solid business, but they were fundamentally a value retailer. And once value retailers came onto the high street that were selling the same stuff but cheaper, then the writing was on the wall, essentially.
So like Poundland and places like that?
This is it, because it's so price sensitive. So people who are going to Wilco's because the bleach is £1 would go then to Poundland if it's 99 pence, or Aldi if it's 49.
Is that what I didn't? Oddly, I'm good on shops, Sean, but I've got a big blind spot on Wilco.
Wilco's really are the people that put Woolworths under.
Yeah, got it.
Because they were doing what Woolworths did, but they were doing it better and they were doing it cheaper.
And when Woolworths first opened, it was a penny store, wasn't it? Was it Winfield, the family name? And it was you could go there and get anything.
That is actually a bit before even my time, James.
Yeah, all right, mate. Don't rub it in. I think get knotted. I was only 18 when you started work as a recruitment retail consultant
right.
in 1990.
Cheers,
yeah, carry on.
Cheers, mate. So I think what they didn't do is they didn't react to it. So when these other people came onto the high street, B&M and Home Bargains and all the rest of them, they didn't react to it. And what their reaction was, we're losing money, let's reduce staff, which reduce service. I was saying to your researcher that retail going forward has to be giving a compelling reason for people to shop.
But what does that mean? Because I hear that a lot. What does it mean?
Experience.
Right.
What you want is experience. You want to be able to offer something that the internet or just the price can't. So I'll go to Aldi and I won't have a great experience.
But you'll come out quids in.
And it'll be cheap. But so if I'm going to make considered purchases, I want service and standards and visual merchandising and a reason to go. I said to your researcher, a couple of my clients are garden centre businesses, and they've really clocked that idea.
They've become a destination, but the high street's dead. Under this analysis, the traditional retail-based high street can't provide what you provide on a scale that sustains it geographically.
And you can offer experience. It's interesting.
Like what? Give me an example.
Well, if I go, without naming names,
you can name names if you want. I don't mind.
I'm an outdoor enthusiast, so I do a lot of walking, a lot of skiing, that kind of thing. So I buy branded products.
Yeah.
Now that means I know what I want. So I want a pair of walking boots, and I know which pair of walking boots I want. I go online, I Google it, I buy the cheapest.
Right.
If I walk into Cotswold Outdoor and say, tell me about these boots, and they say, I don't know anything, or they look at their computer. I went into a well-known electrical shop looking for a fridge the other day, and the guy went on his PC and told me to buy it online.
Yeah, that was Curry's.
Well done.
Yeah, it happened to me with I wanted to get an Apple Watch. Exactly the same thing happened.
Told me to buy it online, and you just think, what are you doing? You know, what are you doing? So I think it's service is number one, standards two, and then if you want to be frilly with a great big restaurant or there's a garden centre up in Hertfordshire that's got a windmill and a train, and another one in Oxford that's got a carp lake and has but this is you're proving. I
think we're agreeing with each other. Is you can't do that on the high street. The electronics retailer maybe could work, but they that's economies of scale now. You used to have a branch of Curry's next to WH Smith's, and you could go in there and buy what you needed. Now they're the size of aircraft hangars.
Get it. If you're stuck on the high street, the things that you've got are service, standards, availability. There's a very well-known phrase in retail: you can't sell space. So you've got to have the stock. You've got to have good service with people who know what they're doing.
I don't think you. I mean, that is sustaining a shop on an individual premises level.
I think independents have still got. There's still a room for the independent retailer. But I don't think as many people are as price sensitive as maybe they thought they were.
Maybe.
There's a bar in Maidenhead that sells very, very expensive beer, and it's just opened. It's opened about 300 feet from a Wetherspoons, and yet that bar is packed.
Because the experience is vastly superior.
100%. And the funny thing is, Maidenhead, funny enough, seems to be they're redeveloping Maidenhead Town Centre at the moment, and they're actually,
what are they
by
doing?
the look of it, it looks like they're going more about residential and experience. A lot of restaurants.
Yeah, but this is it. So it's exactly that. So much fewer premises. More environmental improvements, whether it's parks, more residential, and then destinations rather than.
Oh, I think so. And because this is the thing. If I want to shop in Next, I live in Maidenhead. If I want to shop in Next, I can go to Next in High Wycombe, Next in Reading, Next in Slough. Do I really need a Next in Maidenhead?
No. Well, that's the point. Whereas when we were kids, you'd have a Next in every town, and sometimes more than one. Actually, in a city, you'd have more than one. Thank you, Sean. I love these conversations. I don't know why. I think part of the reason I love talking about it on the radio with people like Sean and you is because it's true universal. The conversation about shops. I've always said it's truly universal. Everyone has an investment, an emotional investment in shops, in retail. But, of course, I hadn't clocked before how different that investment is going to be according to where you live. No decent suggestions yet on how you would turn that statistic about London. Take London out of the equation and the per-head GDP of this country would be lower than that of Mississippi, the poorest state in the United States of America. Perhaps inevitably, Douglas Carswell, Bernard in Newcastle tells me, made the news this week by comparing the UK economy with the part of the USA he now lives in. I think it might be Mississippi. Unfortunately, he did not adjust his numbers for inflation, so his comparisons were significantly different. This relates to your discussion now. It's in this week's Private Eye, which is actually my treat for reading on the bus home later today, Bernard. So I shall look forward to that. There's a blast from the past. Douglas Carswell, good God. I had to look him up the other day because he features in the new book about the little bit why David Cameron called the flipping referendum in the first place. Carswell was one of those MPs who defected to Farage's outfit and scared the horses for David Cameron. And you sort of look up these people and think, well, he was very big on how much he cared about his constituency. I wonder what he's doing these days. Working for a hard right think tank in Mississippi. Couldn't make it up, could you? 10:46 is the time. 10:50 is the time. You're listening to James OBrien on LBC, where we contemplate the demise, the decline of the UK high street. But we need a better word, don't we? The evolution or the change of the UK high street. There's a certain laziness to coverage of stories like the news that Wilko is going into administration. It's a newspaper-driven laziness. It's driven by news cycles. You just sort of do it as a last post. You play the sad music, metaphorically speaking, and look at the reasons and talk about this or that. But actually, what is happening to high streets will be driven by the need for change, and the need for change is then driven by the failure of what went before. And I don't think anyone's really defending the notion that high streets are going to come back in the way that they existed when we were young, unless you're in London, when it's still perfectly normal to walk up a road, walk past a Marks and Spencer's and a Waterstones and another supermarket, a Tesco Metro, say, and then there'll be an Opticians, and then there'll be a couple of cafes. Actually, depending on how smart the area of London you're in is, there might be 463 different varieties of coffee shop and artisanal baker. And everyone who is in the media having these conversations lives in a complete bubble compared to the rest, pretty much the entire country, including other cities. So that's why we've got it a bit wrong in the past, and we're fixing it today. 10:52 is the time. Dave's in Wigan. Dave, what would you like to say?
How are you?
I'm grand, Dave. What's on your mind? You've got one of those phones that's gone glitchy. We'll sort that out, I promise. Well, we'll try. I can't promise you'll come back. 10:52 is the time. Aziz is in Harrow. Aziz, what would you like to say?
Hi, good morning, James.
Hello, mate.
I feel the internet killed the high street. I personally used to own a nursery shop selling baby goods.
Oh, yeah.
And on a Saturday, I would be packed out with couples who would come in and ask about, what's the best pushchair I should be buying, and what car seat fits best, and getting hours and hours of information from me, and then simply going home and logging onto the internet and buying it from somewhere in Scotland just because it was a fiver cheaper.
Yeah.
And that it's a soul-destroying situation as well, because you spend hours giving information out, giving service out to your customers because you want them to have the best service possible. And then they just end up going on the internet and buying it elsewhere. And that's what kills a lot of
There's not a lot you can do. Do you feel slightly patronised when you hear people saying you'll survive if you provide better service and a better experience?
In fact, that was what prompted me.
I thought it might have been.
I thought absolutely the opposite. I gave everything.
Gave them my blood, sweat and tears, and they all went home and got on Amazon.
Yes, exactly, and that's what prompted me to dial the numbers, simply because of that comment. I thought, outrageous.
I mean, there's a middle ground, I guess, isn't there? I mean, they're big ticket items as well. The ones you described. The personal service element possibly applies more to less big ticket items. What do you do now? Do you mind me asking?
I service and repair pushchairs now.
Okay. Oh, that's interesting.
And we are the only company in the UK doing it as well. So we're.
Are you still on the high street? Now. Do you still have a premises, or do you?
I have premises, but it's a warehouse space now because we take on pushchairs from all over the country.
How's business?
And now I get couples who are having a second baby coming to me saying, "I've had my pushchair in the garden shed for 2 years, and we're expecting a new baby. Can you clean it up and make it like new for us again?"
What a good idea.
That's what we do.
And is it going well?
Yeah, it's going well. I mean, our biggest problem is marketing.
Well, I'm about to give you a free. I'm about to give you a free advert, so don't hang up. Whatever you do. Where did? I mean, obviously, if I say where did the idea come from? You say I used to have a pushchair shop, but how did you realise that there was a market for this?
Okay, so before I closed my nursery shop, I actually had a situation where a lady was trying to get home, and she had a newborn baby in one hand and a toddler in the other.
Yeah,
and she couldn't fold her pushchair to put it in the back of her car to get home. So she came knocking on my door and said, "Oh, please, can you help me? I'm desperate to get home. Can you fold my pushchair for me?" And obviously there was a problem with it, but I got a screwdriver out and started tinkering with it and managed to get it into her car, and she got home. Obviously, she was so relieved. She must have told her friends about it. So people used to come into my store where I used to sell pushchairs saying, "You're the guy who fixes pushchairs, aren't you?" I said,
"Well, not exactly, no."
No, but yeah.
And you thought, why don't I become?
People used to just turn up and say, "You're the guy who fixes pushchairs."
And how does it? Sorry, you weren't expecting 20 questions. You weren't expecting the Spanish Inquisition when you rang in. But how does it work on? I mean, do you pick them up? How do they get to you?
Yeah. We can pick them up from anywhere in the UK. We got a courier company that picks them up. We did now, after 14 years of doing this.
Yeah.
Now we deal with a lot of manufacturers, so that we actually work for certain brands.
Gosh.
So we're the main repairers for certain brands if they go wrong.
I mean, you just, because it's, you sort of think exactly that. You think, oh, that's it now. She's walking, I'll stick it in the shed. But then, of course, when the next one comes along, you don't want to go out and buy another one. What is the name of the company, Aziz?
Buggy Pit Stop.
Oh, it's even got a brilliant name, Buggy Pit Stop. And have you got a website? Is it buggypitstop.co.uk?
.co.uk.
Look at that.
Thanks very much.
No, you are. Seriously, that's really exciting. I don't know why that's tickled me so much, but I think that's a brilliant Buggy Pit Stop. There you go. And I mean, it's even worth sending it to Aziz if you're not having another kid. Get it all tarted up a bit and then flog it on the second-hand market. Do you cover that side of things as well?
Absolutely.
Okay, I thought I was giving you some advice. Spare parts, second-hand, you can fix it yourself. Give it to Aziz. Oh, buggypitstop.co.uk. Lovely stuff. Thank you, Aziz. And actually, I know he's not on the high street, but he's off it. That is an evolving business. That is a really good example of how things have changed. You're going to be buying it online, but you're not going to be able to get it fixed online. You're going to have to the vehicle, the buggy, is going to have to go somewhere to be fixed, and there it is. It goes to buggypitstop.co.uk. Dave's in Wigan. We'll have another go. Dave, what do you want to say?
Good morning, James. You okay?
Very well, Dave. What's on your mind?
Right, I live in Wigan.
I know, I just said Dave's in Wigan.
Sorry. Our town centre is currently in the process of being demolished. I mean, the shopping centre was only built in the 80s. It's not old as far as shopping centres go.
No.
And what they're doing is replacing it with a leisure complex. And the council is taking a lot of flack for it, social media, Facebook pages, etc. Whereas, I'm not big on defending the council, but it's one thing I'm quite passionate about, because town centres are finished. You're saying before, is there a solution to it? I don't think there is. I think it now becomes a place where people live.
It becomes something completely different, and that becomes the solution.
Our complex is going to have cinemas, bowling alleys, etc., which is bizarre because the local cinemas just shut down. But one example, we travel a lot, and we go into Telford town centre.
Oh, yeah.
And I actually think Telford is a town where they've got it absolutely spot on and perfect. It's got a park, it's got all the cinemas, all the eating places, it's got a lovely shopping centre. And I just think that is the future. The final nail in the coffin was Debenhams, I think.
Yes.
Because Debenhams was the draw.
Well, these are shops you can wander around.
I think people filtered outwards then, didn't they?
Of course they do. That draws people. That's same in Kiddie, actually. The Debenhams has gone. But it draws people in, and then they shop in all the places around it. I like that. It's mad, isn't it? This is why the lad I mentioned earlier doesn't let people go all rose-tinted and dewy-eyed about the past. Because
and then the people who are quick to jump on the councils, and dissuade them, they forget, I don't know how old you are, I'm 50 years old.
Yeah, I'm the same.
When I was young, if you wanted cash, you had to go to the branch in the town centre to get the money out. There wasn't cash machines on every corner like there is now. If you wanted music, you had to go and buy a disc from
It's just a different world. It's like people being nostalgic for horses after the motor car got invented. It's like going, if we had social media back then, there'd be people that go, oh, I miss the horses. I can't believe we got these cars everywhere and car parks. I miss the horses. That's what it's like. Building anything new, there's someone coming along getting all nostalgic about rickets.
From your opinion, from somebody who's down south, I personally think in the north, town centres are dead.
Yeah.
Do you think town centres are dead? Do you agree?
Where? Outside London?
Yeah, I think that.
They are. I think you missed the top of the show. I think you missed the top of the show, because I grew up in Kidderminster, and they're putting a park there now where Woolworths used to be. It's 2008. It's 15 years since Woolworths shut. They finally got around. I think you spend years thinking, someone else will take it on, or something else will move in. But it does. I think there's a realisation now, it's certainly if this shows anything to go by, that it's not a question of waiting for things to get back to how they used to be. It's a question, as they seem to have grasped in Wigan, and to a lesser extent in Kidderminster, of complete, I believe the modern phrase, Dave, would be repurposing town centres. That could be my next book. It's 11 o'clock. 4 minutes after 11 is the time. You are listening to James OBrien on LBC. Now, I'd like, it's oddly, hardly perennial territory today, isn't it? Shops and property ownership, two of my favourite subjects. It speaks to my class and it speaks to my generation, I think. And interesting, isn't it, how both of those definitions or both of those demographics have changed in the context of the story we're about to do now. Class and generation in relation to property ownership are not in 2023 anything like what they were in the year 2000 when I got married and bought my first property. Now, I don't know how interesting it is to you when I explain the workings of the show. I'd like to think you find it interesting, but if you don't, you must let me know and then I'll stop doing it. But the realisation I made not long ago was that it was universities more than anything else. I suddenly caught myself in the middle of a conversation about universities, realising that I didn't know what I was talking about. And I thought that I did. When I started here, I think I was the only person that had been to university, and I was by far the youngest presenter on the station. And so I thought I was the qualified one. And I was for a while. But then, the clock ticks and the pages turn and the world moves on. And I suddenly realised in the middle of a conversation with someone who was at university that we inhabited completely different universes. I didn't have to borrow money for my tuition fees. I was very nearly snuck in on not having to borrow money for my sort of board and lodging, for my maintenance either. A completely different universe where my experience was utterly irrelevant to conversations about what the experience was like for people in exactly the same position that I had been in 10, 15, 20 years previously. And the same is true of property. And I'll tell you something, and I'll try and do this nicely. I have to do this nicely because it would be counterproductive to do it unpleasantly. The phone calls that we have received over the years, I cannot imagine how frustrating it must be for people who now have to endure the knowledge that they've been dubbed guppies by headline writers, grown-ups grown-up professionals who will never be able to own a home, 18 to 39-year-olds who definitely think they'll be able to buy in the next 10 years. You hear two categories of caller that must make you want to scream. The first is the older caller who contends that the only reason why young people can't get on the property ladder today is because they don't work as hard as they did in the 1950s, 60s, 70s, 80s. I mean, it can bring it right up pretty much to almost to the day, 23 years ago when I got married with a 110% mortgage. And that is just nonsense. With the greatest of love and affection, if you genuinely think that, then you are spouting complete Horlicks. It's just a simple question of multiples. You compare the average house price today to the average income today, and then go back 30 years and compare the average property price then to the average income. You would be looking, for much of the post-war period, you'd be looking at a multiple of 3 to 4. So an average property would be costing you about 3 to 4 times the average annual salary before tax, and you would get your mortgage according to how much you earn, and property ownership was well within reach for people, and that's why some people persist in believing that if only young people didn't have so many Netflix subscriptions and avocado sandwiches. Have you noticed I've started saying avocado pear? Everyone laughed at me when I said avocado pear. Apparently no one else ever says avocado pear. I always thought they were called avocado pears, but I don't say that anymore. Go me. And they had a few fewer avocado open sandwiches, then they'd be able to buy a property in Mayfair. It's just stupid. And the one that really, really riles is you read articles in places like the Daily Telegraph by Jemima Tuffington-Jones about how it's a myth that young people today can't buy a property. I've just bought my first flat and I'm only 7. And then you read the article, and it turns out that her grandma was the Dowager Countess of, Bedfordshire. Which reminds me, we must do Dorry's Watch today. You read that her grandma was the Dowager Countess of Bedfordshire and left her a small island in the Orkneys or something like that. These Daily Telegraph writers claiming it's not that hard to get property. And then halfway through I was very lucky because Mummy gave me a flat and I sold that and bought a house. It's not that hard to buy houses for my generation. I don't know what all these people are talking about. So what's more annoying, the older person pretending that it's the same now that it was then, or the richer person pretending that it's the same for them as it is for you? I don't know, actually. That probably depends a bit on generation and class. So what I want to know is, and then the other thing that happens, actually, crucially, is that the notion of normal changes as well. So I look at this and imagine being 28, I think I was. So I look at this and I imagine being 28 and I imagine being a guppy. And I think I probably would have been, even though I was on a pretty good scratch by the time I was 28. I was showbiz editor on the Daily Express and that came with a good salary, but I had no savings at all. So I probably would have started saving, wouldn't I, and got a deposit together. But I would have been close to guppydom, even though I was, for my age group, quite a high earner at the time. So I'm thinking about this story from the point of view of 28-year-old me. I'm not thinking about this story through the point of 28-year-old you, which makes it a completely different story. Because it's normal now to look down the road ahead and think to yourself, I'm not going to be able to buy a house, or I'm certainly not certain that I'm going to be able to buy a property. And that changes the psychological impact. So there would be a tipping point, if you like, between expecting it as you grew up and then realizing it was not going to happen when you reached adulthood, right? Coming through to not expecting it as you grew up. And while I've been doing this job, we've arrived in that point. While I've been doing this job, you've been growing up, not expecting, as I did when I grew up, to be a property owner later in life. That fascinates me, the psychology of it. So when I say, what is it like to be under 40, okay, under 40 and you have abandoned the dream of getting onto the property ladder in the next decade, the answer, I think, is going to be very different for 25-year-olds than it is for 39-year-olds. 0345 6060 973. What is it like? I want to know psychologically and emotionally, actually, more than financially, because I belong to a generation that very much sees security as bricks and mortar. The difference between having something to fall back on, even if the bank owns half of it, and having nothing to fall back on, to me, is psychologically significant. When I think of my future or my retirement, or God forbid I manage to leave something for my children, it is all tied up in my mind and in my heart with bricks and mortar. So what is it like to be under 40, or over 40 actually, but the research that we're looking at today looks at under 40s, 40% of whom who have now abandoned the dream entirely of getting onto the property ladder. When you look at 18 to 39-year-olds who definitely think they'll be able to buy in the next 10 years, you're looking at about 1 in 5. And this includes people earning up to £60,000. Move to London and you can probably fly that figure higher as well. 38% of people earning 60 grand thought that they won't be buying in the next 10 years. And I find that staggering. But I recognise, and I keep stressing, that it's even more staggering to me because it's so different from what it was like 23 years ago. I can always work out how long I've been married. I'll give you some advice. Get married on a 0 year. And then you'll always be able to work out how long you've been married. So I think, how long have I been married? God, I don't know how long I've been married. Oh, yeah, of course I do. 23 years. It's 2023. I've been married 23 years. So 23 years ago, this would have been unthinkable. And I don't know what it changes about the way you look at the world, the way you look at life. And of course, nor do you, because you're not me. You weren't there 23 years ago, looking at the relative ease with which you could get on the property ladder. But I just want to know how you look at the world knowing that you're not going to have a stake in it, a significant stake in it. 13 minutes after 11, 0345 6060 973. Sorry, I need to clarify something looking at the switchboard. This wasn't an invitation to old people to ring in and tell young people that it's easy to buy a house. I was taking the mickey out of you and pointing out how ridiculous you are. So, Mike, I don't care how much money you think young people spend on Starbucks. You're ringing the wrong show, mate. This is a conversation that reflects reality and evidence, and the reality and evidence is that the average income's relationship with the average house price is exponentially different from what it was like when I was buying my first property 23 years ago. Never mind what it was like when you were buying your first property 147 years ago. 14 minutes after 11 is the time. What's it like to be young-ish and contemplating the possibility of not having a stake in the economy? 0345 6060 973. And categorically not asking what it's like to be old and have a stake. I know what that's like, thank you very much. What is it like to be a guppy? I hate these sort of quasi-acronyms, but that's not actually a bad one. A grown-up professional who will never, they believe, be able to buy a home. How does it change the way you look at the world? I just want to know. It's 11:15, would you believe? You're listening to James OBrien on LBC. The number you need is 0345 6060 973. 17 minutes after 11 is the time. I'd like to go deep on this. You might not fancy it. There's a little bit more than personal circumstance. What does it mean for society? And then you don't have to be personally involved in the story. What does it mean for society if people don't own property on anything like the scale that they have done in previous generations? Does it mean that we will have less smart neighbourhoods if you don't own the place? What does it mean? Given that 40% of people under 40 have abandoned the dream of getting on the property ladder in the next decade. Sarah's in Salford. Sarah, what would you like to say?
Hiya. So I'm 36 years old. I only bought my property 2 years ago. I don't own it outright. It's shared ownership.
Okay.
So I only have 35% of my home. I'm a nurse. I work full time.
Do you get a preferential deal by dint of being a nurse on that kind of thing? You don't.
No,
you should
it was with the housing association.
Okay.
That did it. And a lot of my friends as well, they still rent because they can't afford the deposit for a property in Manchester.
And they never will. They never will,
Yeah.
then, really.
Yeah. And I don't live in an affluent area either. So it just seems impossible to be able to make that step. I mean, my dad bought his house for £11,000.
And he was probably earning 3.5 at the time, or thereabouts, 3 to 3.5.
Exactly. And he managed to pay his off and do everything. It just seems like a bit of a dream at the minute.
Does it matter? I mean, what's your generation like? 36 is the perfect age, actually, Sarah. I mean, because you wouldn't have grown up necessarily expecting to be a property owner, or did you?
So I come from quite a middle-class family.
Yeah.
So we always thought, obviously...
Yeah, no, that's it. That answers my question. Yeah. It's like a conveyor belt, isn't it? And that's what happens next. You get to the property purchasing point, and then you realise, actually, that's going to be out of my reach.
Exactly. My sister's just bought a property in Southend. She doesn't know how she's going to eventually pay it off. She paid a lot of money for her property. And she's in the same position. She's in her 40s as well.
Right.
And she'll be stuck with this mortgage for a long time.
Looking at 35-year mortgages now. I mean, that changes your relationship with everything, doesn't it? With money as well as with property. Does it change the way you look at the future? Does it change the way you... I mean, because you don't know who you would have been if you'd had an easier ride, if it was easier to get property. But do you see what I'm interested in? That question of the stake in society. You've got a stake, but it's not as big as you thought it would be.
Yeah, exactly. So I thought So you want a future for your children, don't you? You want to be able to leave the property for your children.
That's a big part of it. Yeah, or sell it and, whatever it is. It's the thing you pass on.
Yeah, that's the thing we're struggling with at the minute, thinking we need to be able to staircase to afford the whole property.
Yeah.
So my son does have a property when we finish, because otherwise the future is very bleak for him. How is he going to be able to afford everything in the way things that are going?
That's the big bit. I think you're right, Sarah. That idea of what you leave behind. And look, I mean, there are other societies where renting is the norm rather than ownership. And they are, European societies. I think Vienna has an astonishing statistic when you look at how much property there is rented, but it's rent controlled. And the huge proportion of it, I think, is owned by the municipality. So you've got social capital. You've got a stake in society. Even though you don't own the bricks and mortar, you can save money. You can leave cash. You can move on. But you kill yourself to buy a place in order to leave something behind. And now, of course, you're killing yourself to rent a place, and you're not going to leave anything behind. And I think that's a much more significant, a much deeper social and psychological shift than a lot of the coverage, and I'm including myself in this criticism. A lot of the coverage acknowledges it's not just about, I can't do this and I can't do that. I get too distracted, obviously, by, why do they drink so much Starbucks, or why have they got a Netflix subscription? There's something psychological about the stake. I mean, would you have knuckled down when you knuckled down? Would you have got married or got together or moved in together? Do you know what I mean? You're not just buying a house, you're buying something more psychologically significant. And if you haven't bought it, I wonder whether it changes how you relate to community, society, even perhaps country. I don't know. I could be just flying off on one. It happens. Kiri's in Gosport. Kiri, what would you like to say?
Hi, can you hear me?
Loud and clear. That's how phones operate generally.
I just wanted to call up because I just feel a bit detached from adulthood, if that makes sense.
Wow. Well, yeah. What an amazing way of putting it. Tell me more.
So I'm 30. I'm a manager in a company. I live on my own. I live in a house that my granddad very kindly allows me to live in. It's a house he used to own.
Okay. Well, he still owns it, does he?
He still owns it, but unfortunately he's very poorly. Right. And I'm not sure how much longer I'm going to be able to live in this house.
Okay.
I don't have a bank of mum and dad. No. I don't really have a good relationship with my father.
I'm sorry to hear that.
My mum and I don't have a great relationship either. We do, but it's rocky. And the house I live in, when my granddad finally does leave,
yes,
my mother and I and a few other of my family will inherit this house. And it's not a big house. We live in a fairly, it's not worth a lot.
Okay.
So when I do finally have this little tiny bit of inheritance,
yes,
I will have to ask my mum, who doesn't own a house either. She also lives in a council house.
Right.
If she would be willing to give me some of her inheritance for me to get on the ladder.
Yes.
And that just breaks my heart. I could never ask her to do that.
Hey, I'm sorry. I didn't. Oh, crikey. That's just a mark of what a nice person you are. And also, I hope this doesn't sound patronising, but don't forget your mum's agency. Speaking as a parent, that might be what she wanted to do with her money, and it's her prerogative entirely. It's her right entirely, and and also be kinder to yourself, Kiri, if you can. Don't beat yourself up like this, because none of what you've just described to me is your fault or in any way your responsibility. It's circumstances that have got you in their clutches, isn't it? Not choices or behaviours.
It's tricky because...
Of course it's tricky.
Sorry. It's tricky because a lot of my friends, they're older than me. They're nearer 40 than 30 now.
Right.
And a few of them, some of them rent, but some of them do own houses. And I just don't see myself ever being able to get...
And that's what you mean by being detached from adulthood. Listen, exactly. It's not much consolation given that you've got upset, but you are the perfect caller for this. That was exactly the kind of insight I was trying to get my head around and failing utterly to articulate. Because, we may need to rethink our concepts of adulthood, the idea of tying property ownership in with adulthood.
I can't imagine myself having... I have a partner, but I can't imagine us starting a family without the security of a
having
house.
It behind you. And yet, obviously, every year millions of people do.
Of course, but
it's not how you've grown up. It's not your expectation.
No, exactly.
Well, I don't know what to say really, except don't worry about stuff that hasn't happened yet, and don't forget that most of us parents, and I appreciate you don't get on with your dad, but most of us reach a point in life where really one of our main purposes is helping our children out and pushing our children sometimes into places that we didn't manage to get to ourselves. So I don't second guess your mum on this one. Is all I can say really.
It's just like, for example, as well, my father, he lives in New Zealand with the rest of my family.
Yes.
And I desperately want to see them. I really do. It's been 20 years since I've seen them last.
Oh.
And as an adult, I thought, right, I'm finally going to be able to do it. But every year it gets more expensive to go over there. I make savings, but I think, I want to learn to drive. What do I put my money into? Do I put it towards a house I'm never going to be able to afford? Do I put it towards learning to drive, which is getting more expensive every year? Do I put it towards finally seeing my family?
Getting to New Zealand. Well, I'm the last person. I'm the last person to offer advice to anybody else. We had a phone in last week about life coaches, and it was it was relevant to how you sound today, Kiri, because it was about helping people prioritise. But of course, you're immediately thinking, well, how much is that going to cost?
Exactly. And I have a partner, and we could go in on a house together, but
can they drive?
No.
Oh, that's sorry. I thought I'd just come up with a brilliant idea then. I was going to get them to give you driving lessons.
But, for example, you don't want to rely on your partner's finances. You don't want to rely on your partner's family. You want to be independent. You want to be, I'm a woman in this day and age. I want to be an independent person.
Of course you do, but again, you're sometimes it's nice to go in with someone else. It doesn't involve any surrender of independence.
Will.
If I were to bring Brexit into the conversation, you can retain your sovereignty while still being part of an economic union, Kiri.
Yeah, the problem is we don't live together. He lives up the country,
right.
So at the moment,
you
it
poor
wouldn't make
thing.
sense.
You've got so much going on. You've got so much going on. I would, in my patronising middle-aged way, I would simply suggest that you pick one goal and aim for it, and then when you've achieved that goal, pick another one, and have a proper chat with your mum and your partner about where you see yourselves in 12 months' time or 2 years' time. But then, as I stress, I am the last person on earth to be giving advice, life advice to anybody. But be kind to yourself, Kiri.
But yeah, that's the situation. I think kind. A few people can.
And although you are far from alone, lots of messages coming in with enormous sympathy. But be kind to yourself. Remember to be kind to yourself. You're a good person. You're a nice person. You don't need to beat yourself up as well as suffering from the congregation of circumstances. 28 minutes after 11 is the time. John in Southampton, a nice late entry into Idiot's Corner. I see you are not talking about the biggest story of the day, James. 750 migrates in one day. John, it's only the biggest story in your world because you're a frightened racist, mate. who voted, presumably, for the government that's completely failing to get its head around the problem that you're obsessed with. The rest of us are getting on with life, not living it, staring at vulnerable foreigners while either rubbing our thighs or gnashing our teeth, or in your case, I suspect both. So on you crack. It's coming up to 11:30. That's Idiot's Corner, open for the day. We should have a little bell. Idiot's Corner, open for business this morning. Ding, 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 ding. And in he comes. You are listening to James OBrien on LBC, where we are talking about the concerns of ordinary people, real people, normal people, not immigration-obsessed xenophobes, which may be a bit of a shock to the system for at least one listener, but obviously delights the massive majority. 0345 6060 973 is the number you need. While yuppies or young urban professionals of the 80s and 90s were driving BMWs and sipping martinis, today's equivalents are more likely to be living with their parents and fretting over the cost of a coffee. And that slightly glib introduction to this story nails it completely. It's a completely different proposition to be in your 20s or 30s today than it was 20 or 30 years ago. And yet so much of the coverage continues to sort of peddle the myth that it's exactly the same. And it's people like Kiri who are responsible for the situations that they find themselves in, not much broader economic tides. 11:30 is the time. Thomas Watts is here now with your headline. Oh, gosh, what a subject. Dave's in Plymouth. James, I'm coming from a slightly different angle. I'm retired. I've been lucky enough to build up a decent pension pot and have enough now for a comfortable retirement. But now I'm slightly reluctant to spend it because I feel that my children and grandchildren are going to need it more than I do. The whole system seems skewed against people on moderate incomes who are younger than me. We live in a messed up country. You see, good for you. I didn't want to give the impression. I think Susie was cross with me, thought I was being a bit ageist. I'm not suggesting all old people are in the business of claiming that young people should just have fewer Starbucks coffees and avocado sandwiches and then they'd be able to buy properties. I was literally talking about old people who think that, and they generally on these sort of phone-ins are disproportionately represented. But I'm politely encouraging you not to ring me today while recognising that there are hopefully more people like Dave than there are in the category I've just described. Because when you say that the idea that the system is skewed against people on moderate incomes, I turn to this text. It says that Kiri's phone call is so familiar to me, James. I had my girlfriend in tears on my shoulder a couple of days ago. We earn good money and we're stuck in the rental trap with less and less left at the end of the month now. She says she feels worse off at 35 than she did at 25, despite earning more than ever. Homeowning represents security for a generation that are having to deal with the fact that everything they were told growing up hasn't come true, and who have spent their whole adult lives dealing with falling living standards and wages. And now it's getting further away than ever. It is truly bleak. I think it is truly bleak. And I'm glad today that I've managed to get to the place where we're recognising and understanding that. I don't think we've necessarily got there completely in the past. And Kiri's phrase about feeling detached from adulthood seems to me to be a distillation of what I've tried to describe. So 28-year-old me with a 110% mortgage, I suddenly felt like a grown-up. And I'd done nothing. Except find a flat to live in, make a couple of phone calls and get a mortgage. That was it. I hadn't saved up. I hadn't, done any heavy lifting. That was it. I'd fallen in love. And I'd got a 110% mortgage. And then I suddenly felt like a grown-up. I also got married. That probably contributed to it as well. I feel detached from adulthood because I'm still paying rent like I did when I was a student. I get it. I'm sorry that I don't know what to do about it. Dave's in Colchester. Dave, what do you reckon?
Morning.
Hello, Dave.
The biggest problem I think a lot of new-time buyers are sort of facing now is once they've saved the deposit, you've then got the interest rates that are now just putting the kibosh on it. I mean, we've managed to save up for a deposit, myself and my other half. We've done pretty well before COVID. COVID came along and, I had to go out of work. I own my own business doing engineering and all my contract work dried up, so I had to change jobs. So the deposits that we had ready to go, that's all had to sort of be put on living.
Yes.
And now we've sort of got to the point where we've got a deposit and trying to look for mortgages.
And then along come the interest rates.
Yeah.
So, couldn't make it up, could you?
No. So we're now sort of stuck in the situation where we've got a good deposit. but it's now the interest rates that are killing it.
So you're going to sit tight for a while and wait until they come down again, or you don't. You jump now because otherwise you're carrying on paying rent. It's a tough one, isn't it?
That's the other issue. We've got 2 kids. We sort of just generally living at the moment is now what's putting every a strain on everything. I like I said, had my own business before COVID, worked sort of 16 hours a day.
Yeah.
So, when people say, they don't work hard.
No, we ignore those people because they're idiots.
Well,
so did you say your age? How old did you say you were?
I'm 38.
38. So I think under what I'm hearing between the lines of what you're saying, Dave, is that you thought you'd have got to that milestone by now, and you've kept your side of the deal, as it were.
Yeah. I mean, we sort of we decided, we weren't getting any younger, so we thought we'll have kids first, and we'll sort of go on the renting game, and then sort of save a little bit for a house when house prices weren't too bad and mortgage rates were okay. But like I said, then COVID come along and put the hit on that, and we're sort of not quite back to square one again, but no,
it's a big setback. It's a big kick, and does it change the way you look at society? Do you think? I mean, as a father, and as a man approaching 40, you sort of, if you had bricks and mortar, you would almost feel differently. That phrase that I just used, I felt like a grown-up, but I was 11 years younger than you and a lot less responsible by the sounds of it when I got on and I wasn't a parent, but there was a sort of notion of adulthood being linked to property ownership. Do you have that or not?
Yeah, I think everybody does. I mean, like you say, you sort of, when you think of growing up, there's a couple of things that happen in your life that make you grow up, and that's having kids and owning your own house. And I think you sort of do look at it from you've reached adulthood is when you've got your house, and that sets you off in a good stead for the rest of your life.
Yeah, but and not getting there probably just sort of, it's subconscious, probably just changes the way your gears turn, or I don't know. Dave, thank you. Good luck. I don't know what I'd do in your circumstances, but at least you've got choices. Choices are a privilege, aren't they? Choices are a consequence of combination of luck and effort and various other variables, but of course the conversation previous was about people who felt they had no choices. Mark in Dartford said, please introduce Idiot's Corner with a bell like they have at boxing matches. It would be an incredible asset to your already incredible show. That's how lovely. Thank you, Mark. I don't know if I can add that to the sound effects list. I could do it myself. I could have a little bell in here and just go ding, ding, ding. Idiot's Corner is open. 20 to 12 is the time. Annie is in Putney. Annie, what would you like to say?
Hi, James.
Hello.
I mean, I really resonate with what Kiri had to say about being detached from adulthood. You see it a lot for our generation.
It's not a phrase I've heard before, but it's not one I'm going to forget.
No, me neither. I'm 26. I'm a renter. I think the possibility of home ownership looks quite precarious with mortgage rates. And I think that, you've got models like in Germany where there's rights to renters, renting controls, and where only 50% of the population actually own. So you've kind of got a model there where renting works. But I've got friends, I've got clients that are turfed out of their houses, their flats, with 1 month's notice because the landlord wants to, sell up or something.
Yes, precariousness. Precariousness.
It's really precarious. And I think that in terms of looking at adulthood, you have delayed development because you have 28-year-olds, 29-year-olds living at home because renting is impossible on a good salary and home ownership is just, unimaginable. And so you have people who are in their late teens that in your generation or another generation would have been progressing with their life, going through the milestones, is not possible. You're not able to have casual sex, you're not able to have kind of build relationships when you're living with mum and dad if you have the luxury of living with your mum and dad. Yeah. And you have this delayed developmental model, which makes it really difficult for people to progress. And I think it sends us into a bit of an existentialism of like, what's this all for? I'm going to work, I'm hustling 9 to 5 every day, but what for what? What's the security I'm going to get at the end of this? And I think it's really difficult.
That's an extraordinary analysis, if you don't mind me saying so. And it makes me somewhat ashamed of my introduction to this topic, because between you and Kiri have said all of the things that I was hoping to say and failed almost completely, possibly because you need sometimes to be in it to see it. You need sometimes to be living it to be able to fully articulate it. But I sense you have a professional background in this kind of thing as well. Or you did it at university or something like that, when the notion particularly of developmental delay.
Definitely, yeah.
Yeah, good. I was just checking. How would that manifest itself? Well, you're talking about infantilization, if we were going to be mean. Unconscious infantilization, particularly for men, I imagine. If they're still getting mummied at home, they're going to be even more emotionally slow 100%. To develop than they would be outside. I hadn't thought of that.
There's a stunting that happens when you're not able to be an adult in the world with choices and have to make responsible actions because you're forced at home.
Yes, that's so I did become a grown-up because I had a mortgage. I did, even if it was an easy mortgage, and I got it quite easily, and it was, but it was there, and I couldn't. There was nowhere else to turn. You pay your more. Yeah, you're right. Actually, can you guard against it? I mean, what advice do you give to people who are suffering from the kind of existential angst that you've described? What can you do about it?
Well, I would say therapy, but it's
therapy, but then that's
however, it's not affordable.
No.
Exactly. So I would say to ground yourself in kind of the materialism of the real world, where you are able to have some agency and some choice and make some sort of adult decisions. But we are being infantilized as a generation. And that's for people who are lucky enough to have mum and dad or family to rely on, but that's not the reality for a lot of people.
A lot of people who don't, either for geographical or family reasons, or just because people aren't around anymore. Thank you, Annie.
But the angst has to be channeled somewhere.
Yes, otherwise, I think Kiri sounded like someone who wasn't channeling her angst, didn't she? And that was very sad to hear.
It feels hopeless.
That was the word, detached from adulthood and developmental delay are my takeaways so far.
Thanks, James.
No, thank you, Annie. Thank you. Crikey, a lot of people commenting on the quality of that analysis. Carl in Liverpool adding to it, this phone-in makes me feel seen, James. Home ownership is a dream that is now unattainable for us, 2 civil servants, and we're reluctant to grow our family due to the instability of renting. It makes us feel like failures, especially as a man who earns very good money. It's just too far away, and it is genuinely ruining lives. It's incredible, isn't it? The notion of the difference in the life you're leading as opposed to the life you were expecting to lead. An accusation of this being a very Southern-centric conversation. It really isn't. I appreciate properties are less expensive outside the South, but Carl was in Liverpool describing exactly what we were talking about. 11:45 is the time. It is 11:48 and you are listening to LBC. Just a little story for you that might amuse you. Nearly 9 in 10 students in England feel free to express their opinions and beliefs, according to a government-backed survey that rather contrasts all the nonsense we hear about cancel culture on campuses, doesn't it? So it's a question added to the Office for Students' National Student Survey, and it found that 86% said they were free or very free to express their ideas, opinions and beliefs during their studies, with just 3% claiming that they were not free at all to express their views. So that's the next generation of Daily Telegraph column writers there in that 3% who will be writing columns about how they're not allowed to express their views while writing columns about their views. So a weird little glitch in the matrix of the British media post-Brexit, all this talk of cancel culture and wokeness and how you're not allowed to say what you want anymore is all done by people who have some of the biggest platforms in the country. And the irony seems to be completely lost on them. At 10 to 12 is the time. You're listening to James OBrien on LBC. A really, really good conversation today about property. I just want to say thank you before we return to it for that. Because, there are days, aren't there, where it can be a bit, you're looking at the news and you think, oh, he's done that before. But you've got to get the questions right. They've got to get into it right. And those 2 phrases there, the developmental delay and the feeling detached from adulthood, sum up what I was worrying about at 11 o'clock, this idea that the behind the sort of crass simplism of calling this generation guppies, grown-up professionals who don't think they'll ever own a property, there are much more significant factors at play, quite important social changes at play, and You've articulated them today quite spectacularly, quite beautifully, actually, I would say. But I don't know what we do about it, except, I guess, acknowledging a problem is the first step towards addressing it. Danielle's in Leon C. Danielle, what made you pick up the phone?
Well, I was just listening to what everybody else has been saying, and it really hit home. I'm a 35-year-old mum of two with a partner, and we're stuck in the rental cycle. We've been renting for 12 years. We now pay £1,500 a month rent, and I run my own business. We both earn well, but we are stuck in this cycle of struggling to save for a deposit. The house that we rent, it's a lovely house. We've got good landlords, which they travel, and they've got older children. So we are in a position where we probably could buy that house.
Yes.
But it's whether we'll be able to we'll be able to afford to save the deposit for it, get a mortgage. I mean, clearly we can afford the rent. We've been paying rent for 12 years, but it's just knowing what the options are out there.
Yeah, it's a right old pincer movement, isn't it? I mean, I'll tell you what, Danielle, we've got to 11:52 without me pulling this cliche out of the bag, but I think it counts. You've got enough to buy a house. In fact, you've been buying a house for 12 years. You've just been buying it for someone else.
For someone else, I know. And my mum was a single mum and bought her council house, built on it. She's now 5 properties down where she's built on every house and made money on every single house. But she was in a position to do that back then, and we just don't have that option.
That's why we call it a ladder. That's why we call it a ladder, isn't it? You get higher up every time.
Yeah, their house that they've bought now, they bought it for 400 grand. They've done it up. It'll probably be worth 850.
Yeah. Does it change the way you feel about? Does it change your place in the world? Do you think? Do you mean at the age you are now, you thought you would be somewhere else in relation to this specific element?
Yeah, it kind of what Kiri said with adulting. I'm a mum, so I'm an adult in that sense.
Sure.
But this is like the last piece of the puzzle.
Yes.
The last bit to make us feel secure. I mean, we've got good landlords, but they could turn around and say they want to sell tomorrow, and then where does that leave us?
Yes, that's it. Exactly that, actually. It's that precariousness, which I think we associate with youth, is now moving into, people's 30s, people's late 20s, 30s, even 40s, where you're not, barring disaster, like illness or losing your job and not being able to find another one, you normally by now would expect to have more control over your own destiny. And when you're a tenant...
I kind of wish we never rented in the first place, because if we'd have stayed at home longer, we could have been in a completely different position.
Yeah, but you were desperate to get out, weren't you?
Yeah.
So you just don't know. You have a conversation with your 23-year-old self, it would be, she's not going to believe you when you say, Danielle, you've got to stay there for a bit longer. You'd be like, get lost, you stay there. I'm not staying there. I've got to get out. I'm 23.
Yeah, exactly.
I want to wake up in my own place. Oh, it's a tough one. As I said, we're not really nailing solutions to this today, but we're certainly nailing the notion of people feeling isolated in their situation, because it's the polar opposite. There are millions of people up and down the country reflecting exactly what you describe, and what you say resonates with them just as what they've said has resonated with you. The numbers are significant. And look, talking about the social change, what this does is it drives ever bigger wedges between socioeconomic groups. So what you're seeing now is the children of homeowners not being homeowners. Danielle's description of her mum's property journey, if you like, is absolutely fascinating, because it's unreachable, it's unattainable for her children. That's the first time in British history, or certainly the first time in the post-war period of ownership, when children are not expecting to go further than their parents in this particular field, to either earn more or own more. You would generally see an improvement. The graph was a gentle incline upwards. And now, I forget precisely when, but in the last few years, certainly since 2010, the graph has started coming down. And you now have less expectation than your parents had. And that's, I don't know whether it was inevitable or whether different politics could have created a different scenario, but that's a really significant thing for a society, when you talk about engagement, when you talk about adulthood, development, delay, feeling detached from adulthood, and precariousness, being mistress or master of your own destiny, and then down it comes. That matters. And the reason I mentioned divides is because for the people who can still afford, largely through parental help, who can still afford to get on the ladder in their 20s or early 30s, they are going to sort of not pull up the drawbridge behind them. What's the figure of speech I'm looking for? They're going to get a boost up. The gap between that's going to become a much smaller cohort. So inequality, if you like, is going to become a lot more pronounced. And then, of course, the buy-to-let experience kicks in, and people like Danielle are buying properties for people who were already on the winning side of this economic phenomenon. 11:56 is the time. Joe's in Rushden in Northamptonshire. Joe, what would you like to say?
Well, I really love what the previous callers about to say, and I think your word there, precariousness, is really important. I think the harm of wanting to buy a home is security. Yes. You want security about the place where you live. You want security for your home. I'm not too fussed, particularly about whether I rent a property or whether I own a property, if I can have that security. Okay. I think a great solution would be to increase massively the security that tenants have. Britain has got some of the most pro-landlord tenancy laws in Europe. You know, if you cannot agree to the rent increase, there is currently nothing stopping a landlord turfing out the tenants for no reason with 2 months' notice, getting new tenants in. And that lack of just feeling, that lack of care, solidity, that this is somebody's home, this is where they build their lives, this is where they eat and laugh and sleep and make love to their partner, and this is where they do life.
It's all gone a bit Swiss Tony now, Joe. But I take your point. You're absolutely right. Let me pick up on you briefly. Are you sure? Are you sure that? So, how old are you? Mid-20s?
I'm about to turn 30.
Are you? Are you sure that future stake is not relevant to you? Because you know that for me, it probably was linked to becoming a parent and wanting to pass something on. But it doesn't have to be property, does it? It could just be cash.
It could just be investment. I think home ownership has clearly played a huge role in how people acquire wealth. And I think it's important that people have that door to them. Yeah. The thing that I care about is that I care about actually not having this very fundamental thing in my life not be put so precarious.
Yeah, where literally you're a phone call. You're constantly a phone call away from having to up sticks and move on again. I think that is very much in the category of things that you can't fully appreciate unless you're in it. I really do. So Danielle mentioned she'd been in the same house for 12, 13 years, but if the landlord has a change in the wind, then you're out. And that is a huge difference. Possibly, Joe's right, actually, an even bigger difference than the prospect of not owning. Thank you, Joe. I'm in Northampton, actually, on the 5th of November at the Royal on my book tour. It's coming up to 12 o'clock. I want to go to Scotland next. Not for the book tour, although I'm doing Edinburgh and St Andrews, I think. I'll get the dates soon. I like this story a lot. I just need to have a little think about the best way for us to approach it together. It's a story about how long it would take for an independent Scotland to rejoin the European Union. And given the trials and tribulations that the SNP has had recently, it throws up a whole bunch of questions, not least, of course, the question of whether or not this is going to come back round again. Or whether it's indeed a game changer. So it could be nearly a decade, according to the SNP's own analysis. But I mean, I know we're supposed to go, that's a long time. I'd take that if I was Scottish. It is 3 minutes after 12. I made a promise, didn't I, about, was it 2 years ago or 3 years ago? It was a New Year's resolution. We've got to get a little bit less London-centric on the programme. Must be going all right, must be going well, looking at the numbers. We did quite a good job, I think, in the second hour when we recognised that a conversation about high streets, first hour, it's completely different depending on where you are geographically, and the London lens, we should call it henceforth, I think. The London lens. You've got to throw away the London lens some days. But the real pledge was to Scotland and Northern Ireland, to focus more upon events there. I think we've probably dropped the ball a little bit on the police Northern Ireland story that has come out this week, but I couldn't see a way into a phone-in on that, so I can only apologise. This, definitely, I want to hear your views on this. I'm really fascinated, as you know, by changing minds. I think the most interesting conversations we have together involve one of us, or possibly both of us, telling the story of how we changed our mind about something. And certainly when you're talking about politics, the less changeable your mind is, the less capable of change you are, the less interesting we become. And that's not just, that's me, at least as much as you. If you're really stuck on rails in terms of your opinions, then you become very boring very quickly. A bit like news. I mean, I know it can be very comforting, but if you name a newspaper columnist and then name a subject, and then I'll tell you what they think, they're not the columnists I enjoy reading. You name a newspaper columnist and then name a subject and then press the button and the wheels start turning, and then they come out with an interesting take on it. Sometimes it means that a column by someone who you find repellent in other circumstances is by far the most interesting column in the papers that day. But obviously the Murdoch Mail model demands generally that you put a penny in the slot and get out exactly what you were expecting. So that ability to change your mind, voting is a great example. The most interesting callers when we're trying to pinpoint political change, the most interesting callers are the voters who could go either way. You're talking about the decline of the Conservative Party becoming a place where 30p Leanock could be able to F and Jeff in public and get the support of I think everybody has come out in support of them. They kind of have to. That kind of moral decline, that ethical decline of the Conservative Party is much more interesting when it's discussed by Conservatives than it is by people looking for opportunities to put the boot into the Conservative Party. And I found Scottish independence very like that as well. The most interesting people on Scottish independence, and here's me about to alienate everybody, the most interesting thing on Scottish independence are the people that could go either way, the people that voted against it when they had the referendum but would probably vote for it now, or indeed vice versa. And then Brexit came along. And I thought it was going to change absolutely everything. I thought Brexit was going to be the biggest boost to the Scottish independence movement ever. Bigger even than Nicola Sturgeon's leadership. And it has not turned out that way. It simply hasn't. I know that the SNP and indeed Nicola Sturgeon have had a very tough time of it in a variety of ways. Excuse me, I've got a frog in my throat. I do apologise. I shall endeavour to deal with that imminently. The difficulties that the SNP in general and Nicola Sturgeon in particular have had, notwithstanding, I genuinely thought that the simple offer to go back into the European Union as an independent country would see support for independence absolutely rocket. God, it hasn't happened for ages. Listen, let pause a minute so I can deal with my my tickly throat. I've got to record the audio book of the new book next month. And that means I'm going to do a 3-hour radio show, and then I'm going to do a 7-hour... I'm going to be talking more or less interrupted for 7 hours. So 3 hours when you're allowed to interrupt me, but the length of my monologues these days, you'd be forgiven for not knowing you're allowed to ring in. And then a 7 to 8 hour... I'm very, very worried about my voice, is what I'm saying. I'm going to have to get some Strepsils or some honey, sort of a honey-based drink or whatever it may be. But I apologise at 8 minutes after 12 for the next 52 minutes, which are likely to be punctuated by me. I don't think there's any point playing a clip of Dale Vince at this point, because I'm still going to have a tickly throat when we come back. I apologise for that. Desperately unprofessional of me. I should probably talk a bit less, take a few more calls. But I haven't set up this hour's topic yet. Now, it's gone now, I can tell. I haven't set up this hour's topic yet. I thought that... Probably because I was a bit of a Brexit obsessive. I thought if someone offers me a chance to go back into the European Union, I would take it. But the Scottish identity is not a simple thing, is it? Membership of the European Union for a while looked like a... what's the thing? It looked like a catalyst. It looked like a turbo boost for Scottish independence. And for a while it did seem to be doing that to the polling. And my callers, we took callers, but we're a self-selecting panel, aren't we? You're ringing this programme, the chances are that you are in a constituency that considers European Union membership to be quite important. And the idea that you could get back in as an independent Scotland and what that would mean for Great Britain or the United Kingdom was absolutely riveting. And now we know that you'd face a wait of nearly a decade to join the EU after independence. I think the best case scenario would be between 3 and 4 years. It's the Telegraph that have written this up. And when I was reading it, I really noticed the spin that has been put on it by the Telegraph. Because I think 3 to 4 years is an astonishingly good deal. And I think nearly 10 years, in the great scheme of things, I'd bite your arm off. And yet the Telegraph are writing it, as they would, as a very unionist paper. The Telegraph are writing it very much from the perspective of, terrible news for the nationalists, terrible news for the Scotnats. Scotland would face a wait of nearly a decade to rejoin the EU after independence, according to the SNP government's own officials. In an internal analysis, civil servants warned, didn't reveal, you see, isn't language fascinating? Civil servants didn't warn, civil servants simply reported. But by the time it's been put through the mangle of anti-independence in the Daily Telegraph, it's a warning. It's a warning. I mean, it could have been cheered. Civil servants cheered the news that it would only take up to 8 years. Do you see what I mean about words? How important it is, how you phrase this stuff. Let me rewrite the first 2 paragraphs of this Daily Telegraph story from the point of view of being pro-Scottish independence. So this is what it's like when it's anti-Scottish independence. Scotland would face a wait of nearly a decade to rejoin the EU after independence, according to the SNP government's own officials. In an internal analysis, civil servants warned that it could take up to 8 years for a Scottish state to rejoin the bloc, while even under a best-case scenario, the process would be between 3 and 4 years. Okay, rewind. Okay, pro-independence point. Scotland would face a wait of just 1 decade to rejoin the EU after independence, according to the SNP government's own officials. In an internal analysis, civil servants revealed that it would take just 8 years maximum for a Scottish state to rejoin the bloc, while in a best-case scenario, the process could take as little as 3 years to be in the EU and independent. They were celebrating on the streets of Dundee last night. Well, obviously, I've got a bit carried away in paragraph 3 there. But that is absolutely fascinating, isn't it? The idea that you can just change the way the story feels entirely according to your own prejudices and biases. But I just want to know from you in Scotland what you think about that. Can you tell me why the prospect of rejoining the Europe or being able to rejoin the European Union hasn't had a greater impact on pro-independence support? Could you do that for me? 0345 6060 973. Because I sat here and just presumed that it would. And for a while, for about a year, you told me that it would. So what has happened? Why has independence, support for Scottish independence, not reflected the fact that an independent Scotland could get back into the European Union decades before the rest of the UK is likely to? And as Julie points out, it's 7 years since the referendum now. So even under the worst case scenario, Scotland would be looking at a period of time roughly equivalent to the time that has elapsed since the referendum and now in order to get back in again, which, feels like a drop in the ocean in the great scheme of things. So question number 1, why has the prospect of getting back into the European Union not had a bigger impact on support for independence in Remain voting Scotland? And question number 2 is would it be a game changer for you? Just talk me about your personal relationship with this story. Would it be a game changer? If they did say we could do this, then even though, I guess I'm asking whether your loyalty to the Union of England and Scotland is potentially outweighed by your loyalty to the Union of Scotland and Europe. 03456. How does that work? Psychologically, emotionally, how does that work? There's 2 unions. And if you had to pick one, there's 2 unions and you have an affection for both of them, right? That's what I mean about people who are going to have to change their mind being more interesting than people who never will. You've got 2 unions, but you can only stay in one. What are you going to do? 0345 6060 973. Because I imagine where I'd sit on this, and I would have been a wobbler in the in-out referendum, in the Scotland referendum, in the independence referendum. I'd have been a wobbler. I approach it in two ways, as you may know, if you've heard us talk about this before. I approach it as me, in which case I want Scotland to remain in the United Kingdom. And then I approach it as a Scot looking at London, in which case I would definitely vote for independence, I think, albeit that I'd need to be a lot more informed than I currently am if I were to cast that vote. But me, James, Jimmy from the block, I like the idea that that Scotland is part of me, where I live, who I am. If I was Scottish, I'd feel very differently, I think, looking at the abuses visited upon my country by Westminster. But then again, if it was a Labour government in there, particularly if it was a Scottish Prime Minister, which we had not that long ago, possibly I'd feel differently again. So that's what I mean by being a wobbler. I'm a wobbler. But if it was the European Union in the mix, if EU membership was in the mix, I just presumed that I would put about 5 to 10% minimum on the other side of the scales, on the pro-independence side of the scales. So why has it not had a bigger impact, and is it a game changer for you? 0345 6060 973 is the number that you need. And the Telegraph scaremongering continues. Also highlighted were external warnings that Scotland would be forced to join the euro. I mean, Scotland might be perfectly relaxed about joining the euro. And the Schengen visa-free travel zone, which would mean passport checks for cross-border travel to England. I can see how that's a bit of a mixed bag. On the one hand, it would also mean, of course, no passport checks for cross-border travel to 27 countries, or however many countries are in the Schengen zone. So what has happened? I need my Scottish correspondents to talk me through what has happened to the relationship between the two unions. You can either do the overview in the role of political analyst, or perhaps even more interestingly, you can give me the perspective exclusively from the point of your own life. What's happened to your relationship with the two unions? As Brexit moves further into the distance behind us and the road in front becomes less clear, what's happened to your relationship with those two unions? Would you sacrifice one union to rejoin the other? Or, well, whatever. You know how this works. 0345 6060 973 is the number that you need. It's 12:17. 19 minutes after 12 is the time. I'm going to be very invested in Strictly Come Dancing this year, I have to tell you. I've got a couple of people in there who I'll really be rooting for. How many have been on Full Disclosure? Has Les done Full Disclosure? He has, hasn't he? So how many Full Disclosure people are on Strictly Come Dancing this year? Off the top of my head, there's at least 3. Krishnan's done it. Oh, he did the other one. He did the one I did for Joe. But that still counts. Krishnan's done it. Les Dennis has done it. Amanda Abington has done it. Crikey! Oh, is that a record? Is that the most Full Disclosure guests yet on the Strictly? But there's mates there. There's 3 people I consider pals, all on it. Who am I going to be rooting for? I can't wait. 20 minutes after 12 is the time. And we should get Angela Rippon on Full Disclosure as well, you know. She'd be fascinating. I've had some great chats with her over the years. Anyway, I digress. 8 years to rejoin the EU after independence, says the SNP. What do you make of that then? Ruth's in Edinburgh. Ruth, what would you like to say?
Good morning, Brian. Yes, thank you. I love your programme.
Well, you can't love it that much because you just got my name wrong.
Oh, sorry, I have, James.
That's okay. Why do you think... No, I know you are, and I'm teasing you. But why, when people get my name wrong, do they call me Brian?
I don't know. Maybe because it's as short as James. I've no idea.
But it's always Brian. No one ever calls me John.
Is it really?
So, yeah, it's always Brian. Anyway, I know I'm James OBrien, so there must be some glitch there, mustn't it?
Definitely.
You go for the Brian. Sorry, carry on, John.
Yes, no. I'm a huge supporter of Scottish independence. I voted yes in the referendum. I'm a massive believer in the European Union. I voted yes for that. I'm really angry that we were taken out. Every Scottish local authority, people in every area in Scotland, the majority was yes. It was over 60%, I believe. Yeah. And if it has to be 8 years, I actually don't. I think that's a blink of an eye in terms of life. And in fact, I don't think it would be that length of time anyway. I just think Scotland is trying to be a really socially democratic country. And I think England and Westminster, everything, it's such becoming, in some cases, far right almost. And I think we're trying to do things so different.
Almost. I
would actually like you to do a programme about the differences, because I don't think people realise what's going on up here. And I think we only have one newspaper that supports it, the National.
Yes.
Every other paper is a unionist newspaper. And we don't even get covered in newspaper roundups. They don't even mention it.
No, you're right.
You know, everything from our more progressive tax system, from baby boxes to the Scottish child payment, free prescription, free bus travel for young people.
Scottish Water's still publicly owned, isn't it? Different NHS rules. No nurses strike.
It's got, lots of problems, the NHS. Of course it has, like most places, but things are still performing better. We have a PR voting system. It's not first past the post. The way it is, and I just don't think people realise.
I hear you. Hang on. I don't want you to turn my phone into an independence phone in, though, Ruth. That's
right. I understand, but I just think, as a member of the EU, as a country, you have a seat at the table.
Exactly.
We're not in an equal union anymore in Westminster. You know, people, when an SNP MP stands up to speak, most people walk out, they laugh, they deride us.
I don't know if it's quite that bad, actually. Well, I mean, I can't tell you what you see. I can tell you what I see. I think so. I mean, you know, Stephen Flynn in particular is a very effective parliamentarian, and
he's very effective. Yes. He is very effective.
I'd give you an example, because people talk to me about the bias of the media, and because I'm not that invested in the independence argument, I've been a bit slow on the uptake. But this Telegraph article has done, in the space of 10 paragraphs, what hasn't happened to me in 10 years. It's so blatant, isn't it? Listen to this. The documents undermine several claims put forward by SNP leaders who have repeatedly sought to claim an independent Scotland would have a quick path back into the EU. And you're pointing out 7 or 8 years is quite a quick path.
I think it would be less than that. And many individual members of the European Union, I can't remember the actual names, have said we would have an easy passage. You know, why wouldn't we? But to me, 8 years is nothing. It will pass in the blink of an eye. And I also totally get it. And sorry, this is slightly harking back to independence. That
Honestly.
It will be difficult in the first few years.
What do you think about that, though? What do you think about the idea of a hard border?
I don't think there would be a hard border. They don't. Well, look at Northern Ireland and the Republic now.
Yeah,
you know, one's in the EU, Northern Ireland's not.
That could be the model, couldn't it?
Yeah, that could be the model. It would be as hard.
Especially if we've got full regulatory alignment with the EU, which, whether they realise it or not, we are going to end up. We're going to have to end up with it. We're edging there anyway. Then maybe you could have the equivalent of the Irish border. Here,
yes,
Ruth, perfect. Yeah. I'm going to move on, because I sense if I don't...
Can I say one last thing?
See, I nearly just said if I don't move on, you're going to take me all the way to Sheila Fogarty. But go on then, I can't say no.
I know, I could talk till midnight. Wasn't it President Kennedy that said, just because something's difficult doesn't mean you shouldn't do it? That's how I feel about independence. Of course it would be difficult in the beginning, but the rewards would be great, and particularly rejoining the EU. So
thank you very much, Ruth. So steps away from the lectern. 25 after 12 is the time, and I would stress, despite Ruth largely ignoring my attempt to steer her away, I would stress this is not a conversation about independence, full stop. It's a conversation about the relationship between you and two unions. For Ruth, no contest whatsoever. The union with England, straight out the window. The union with the rest of Europe, very valuable. But I sense even without Brexit, Ruth would have been a staunch independence supporter anyway. Chrissy's in Stornoway, Western Isles. Chrissy, what would you like to say?
Hi, James.
Hello.
It's great to talk to you. I listen all the time.
Thank you.
Basically, I kind of wanted to quote Mary Black's most recent speech on it. People are too busy worrying about where your next meal is going to come from, covering your bills, what next nightmare is going to pour out of Westminster. You know, people haven't really got time to be considering the Constitution.
That's interesting.
And it's
I missed that speech. I missed that speech. So she was essentially
it's very good.
Explaining why independence is not burning as brightly as it had done previously.
Yes,
Yeah,
absolutely.
It makes sense. What about you? I mean, does that describe you? Are you thinking, I haven't got time to worry about rejoining the EU or anything like that because I've got to get food on the table?
Not so much. We've actually relocated back to Scotland from England as a result of what's going on, essentially.
Really?
And we're, yes, last year. We're doing much better up here. The lifestyle's completely different.
Especially in Stornoway.
Well, yeah, it's fabulous. But yeah, we've sort of almost escaped that life.
Yeah, no, I get it. So it's a disengagement based on circumstance rather than lack of interest or lethargy. It is literally a prioritization of people's personal issues, and independence may still be something that they feel passionately about, but in terms of the amount of bandwidth you can dedicate to it, it's diminished in recent years. Does Brexit matter to you? Would you? I mean, I sense you're pro-independence anyway, but
yes.
but would if you were a wobbler, if you were 52-48 or even 50-50, would the prospect of rejoining the European Union swing it for you?
It actually did, James.
Okay.
I was a wobbler on Scottish independence. I'm half English. My father was a Yorkshireman.
Right.
So I was a wobbler anyway, but it was, Brexit and the fact that the famous vow was not upheld, everything that happened subsequent to the referendum, the one in 2014,
I think I'd be like
actually
you.
Pushed me.
If I'd been half Scottish, I'd have been like you. Not just on them dragging us against our will out of the European Union, but also, as you say, the very real sense of betrayal. Thank you, Chrissy. It's coming up to 12:30. You're listening to James OBrien on LBC. I mean, I could be wrong. I don't sense at the moment that there are any independence supporters who share the Daily Telegraph's view that this is really shocking bad news. I don't know whether you were anyone. I mean, if you're in the category I'm about to describe, sort of labouring under the illusion that you could just ring up the European Union and say, "Oh, terribly sorry, we've made an awful mistake. We've come on holiday by mistake," to just reference Withnell and I, and then you'd be back in by tea time. You'd be back in by Christmas. I don't know that 8 years does sound like a massive sentence, not least because, as Julie pointed out, it's nearly 8 years. Give it 6 months, and it'll be 8 years since we voted to come out. In terms of years, admittedly, not in terms of months. But I don't know. It looks to me like really, really biased reporting. Words like warn and undermine. As I pointed out at the outset, you could rewrite this article now. You could say the document, instead of saying the documents undermine several claims put forward by SNP leaders, you could literally say the documents enforce several claims put by SNP leaders who have repeatedly explained that an independent Scotland would have a quick path back into the EU because 8 years is not necessarily slow, and it's not necessarily what would happen. It could be 3. So they don't even say the best case scenario would be 3 years. They have to say the best case scenario would be between 3 and 4 years. So between 3 and 4 years sounds longer than 3. The best case scenario is going to be the bottom end of between 3 and 4 years. And the bottom end of between 3 and 4 years is 3 years. That's not an opinion, that's counting. It's 12:30. Amelia Cox is here now with your headlines. It is 12:34. Looking at the Strictly Come Dancing lineup, it is almost the case. It's not, because there are a couple of people there that I don't know personally. But it's very close to being people who I know quite well on a personal level, or people I've never heard of. There's hardly anybody in between. I'm not going to go through the list because I don't think it's fair to. I mean, it's not even important whether I've heard of you or not. But that is bizarre. So there's at least 3 people who I'd go for a drink with. And then there's a couple more who I do know who they are. But then there's a good half a dozen who I've done a job with her as well. And there's another half a dozen that I don't think I've ever heard of. You'd have to tell me who they were, and then I'm sure I'd know. I don't expect anybody finds that remotely interesting, do they? But, Strictly Come Dancing, it's all a bit of fun. Who'd you put your money on now? So, I mean, there's a couple of people there that have been West End stars. Les Dennis. I bet he can dance a bit. Nigel Harman, he was in EastEnders, wasn't he? But I saw him in Shrek, didn't I? I saw him playing Prince Charming in Shrek, so he can do a bit of musical theatre. If you can do musical theatre, you can usually dance. We know that Angela Rippon can dance because we saw her on Morecambe and Wise all those years ago. And Amanda Abbington, I think, told us on Full Disclosure that she's a trained dancer. She originally went into dancing, showbiz-wise, before she went into acting. All absolutely lovely people, so I'm going to be struggling. And I don't know about Krishnan. He's surprisingly musical, Krishnan. His boy played Glastonbury. I don't know if you knew that. His boy's in a band that played Glastonbury this year. But I don't know whether Krishnan strikes me as one of nature's natural dancers. We shall have to wait and see. I'll be enjoying it this year. It is 12:35. Shabir is in Edinburgh, steering us back to the twin or the joint lure of two different unions and the prospect of only being able to stay in one. What would you like to say, Shabir?
Well, I just think that the fact that people think that if Scotland gets independence, 8 years later we'll be able to join the EU again, I think that's a false narrative, mainly because, as you know, every EU country has to agree for another member to join, and countries such as Spain and Italy will be, I think, against it.
Not post-independence.
Sorry?
Not post-independence, I don't think.
Well, how do you mean post-independence?
Well, it wouldn't happen until Scotland was independent, and
that's correct.
The reluctance of Spain looking at the Basque region or Italy with the Northern League, that reluctance would be dissipated by the fact that Scotland was already independent. You're talking about the precedent it might set for a future independent Basque or a future independent Northern Italy.
That's correct.
Yes, but I don't think that's relevant. Personally, I don't. And the SNP's analysis would, of course, have taken that into account.
Well, I don't think it would have taken it into account because they don't mention it at all, and they don't want to mention it at all because they know people will start thinking about it. Quite frankly,
I don't think it's relevant.
I think it is, because if you see a country that is broken away from an internal union,
yes,
rather like the Basques and the Catalans want to,
yes,
and then they have gained independence within the union, that will only encourage them to do the same.
But Italy and Spain are still in the union.
No, Italy and Spain are still in the union. What I'm saying is they will still remain in the union, but if they see...
But that's what I'm saying, it's not a precedent. So an independent Scotland would be applying to join. An independent Basque would not necessarily ever leave.
No, but that's what the Basques want to do. They want an independent region within Spain.
No, I know they do, but they're still in the EU. They're already in it. You're comparing apples with oranges.
The thing is, if the Basque region gets independence...
Well, that's the interesting bit. That's the bit that neither of us know.
Well, that's like saying that Scotland can get EU membership within the UK, which it can't.
No, it's not. It's because Scotland will be independent when it applies for EU membership. Scotland's not in the EU because the UK left. Spain hasn't left.
Yes, but I think maybe we're crossing wires here.
No, we're talking about two different things. You're talking about a country that's not in the EU setting a precedent for a country that is, or a newly independent region that was in the EU before setting a precedent for a newly independent region that was not in the EU before. So that's why I don't think it's relevant. It's going to be a bit relevant, and there's going to be negotiations, and there's going to be issues and problems, but I don't think it's the deal breaker that you're describing, for the very simple reason that the UK has already left the European Union.
No. What I'm saying is that it'll fan the fire in Spain.
Yeah, I do understand exactly.
To push for independence.
I understand exactly what you're saying. I do understand that, but
I think it's a case of that you think it's not going to be relevant, whereas I think it is relevant.
Exactly that.
Yeah,
yes. Yeah. So we can agree to disagree.
Disagree.
Yeah. See, that was quite civilised. But the reason why I don't think it's as relevant as you think it is because we are obviously the United Kingdom is not in the EU. But yeah, I think you're right up to a point, Lord Copper. There will be concerns in countries that resist independence movements from within that this would somehow add to the calls for independence in the Basque region and possibly elsewhere. But listen, I don't know that we'll ever find out which one of us was right, but if it turns out to be you 8, 10, 15 years hence, then I'll give you the money myself. Alex in Fife. Alec, what would you like to say?
Hi, good morning, James.
Hello.
Good afternoon. Yes, the two referendums that we have had were from a position of relatively calm economic waters, and now we're in a completely different place, which is possibly why the support for the EU EU membership has not been as strong as you thought it might have been. Because
or rather, not so much the support for but support for EU membership has not impacted as heavily on support for independence as I expected it to.
For independence,
yeah,
exactly so. Because we've just gone through the brutalisation of Brexit, and people are just
and
so
COVID,
on their knees.
And COVID. To be fair, it's
okay.
That is a big part of what you're describing.
Exacerbated by the dissolution of the EU from our places, from our shores. And so people are really nervous. I mean, really nervous for any kind of change whatsoever. Now.
I think this was what Mary Black was talking about then, according to my caller from Stornoway, that just it's a simple sort of internal prioritisation at the moment and putting either of these...
Food on the table, roof over the head, and then everything else is a bonus at the moment.
Yeah, makes sense, doesn't it? Where do you sit on this? Because what I haven't found is the caller who thought that Scotland would be able to rejoin in 10 minutes.
No. In the same way that we didn't manage to achieve Brexit in 10 minutes.
No,
it would be it'd be a long and fairly painful process, but absolutely worthwhile.
I think I was even. The more I read this Telegraph article, the more I begin to understand what you lot had to go through during the independence referendum when you were reading London-owned media. But I think if you'd said to me this morning, Alec, before I stumbled across this particular story, if you'd said to me, if Scotland voted for independence next week, how long would it take to rejoin the European Union? I think I would have said probably a decade at the outside.
It was almost like don't care.
Yeah.
Don't care as long as it's... And also, here's the thing, an independent Scotland, France, Germany and quite a lot of other countries would bend over backwards to make it easy for us.
Yes, although...
Just to stick it up the English.
Yeah, just to stick it up the English. Although Italy and Spain, for the reasons that Shabir alluded to, might well try to stick a sort of a spanner in the spokes, as it were. But of course they would. I don't think they would prioritise sticking one to the English quite as highly as, for example, a Scottish independence supporter might. But certainly to remind the world of the power of the European Union would be an attractive proposition for them. Thank you, Alec. Joanna is in Stirling. Joanna, what would you like to say?
Hi, James.
Hello.
Yeah, we've spoken about Scotland in the past. I don't remember, there was quite a few years ago.
Of course I remember, because you've got an accent that's half Scottish and half Polish.
Yeah, I do my best.
It's brilliant.
No, I called because I wanted to say something about Poland itself when it first applied. I think it was 1989 when we had first free elections.
Right.
And we started the process in the early 90s, and I was kind of involved. I was a student at the time.
Yes.
And I helped out. I spoke English already, and I helped out some of the short-term experts that came to help with the harmonization of all the legislation. And Poland really started from scratch. It was a deeply communist country with structures that were quite antiquated. It was not ready at all in lots of ways to join the EU. And the process took only to 2004. That's when we joined.
Yeah. So that, and that'd be easier for Scotland. I mean, I would
think so.
Depending on how far regulatory alignment has gone, and I think now I don't know about you, I sense that although they're not obviously going to admit it to their own crazy backbenchers or the sort of Marc Francois of this world, regulatory alignment is going nowhere, and that would make it a hell of a lot easier for Scotland to slide back into the European Union.
That's one thing. Obviously, the bureaucracy is a very slow grinding wheel, so that probably would take some time. And I think a lot depends on the disentanglement of Scotland from the rest of the UK, because if it becomes independent, it won't be just like that. So they may start the application process from the day one, but it will all depend on how it will manage its process of leaving the UK.
Yes, of course.
That might extend the whole situation.
That might well be it. Yeah, that probably is it. Because then, the question of a hard border or an attempt to emulate what's happened in Ireland. Briefly, why do you think, I guess we're getting a consensus on this, why has the enforced departure from the European Union not had a bigger impact on support for Scottish independence? Answer, everyone's got too much to worry about at the moment.
I think people are not connecting to it. Also, I think there's still quite a lot of misinformation or lack of information about what it means.
Yes.
For example, I can hear it a lot. People are comparing those two unions. Oh, one union, the other union. So we left that one. So, this is going to be just as hard. Well, yes, but being part of UK, Scotland is not an equal partner.
No.
And obviously in EU, some smaller countries don't have the clout. And I understand some of the policies are driven by big countries.
Yes.
Particularly Germany is pointed out, and France and Italy. But the small countries still have a voice. They still can say no to certain very important things.
But they have a power of veto, actually, in the purest sense. In a way.
Scotland does not have that power within the UK.
No.
It just is told to sit and shut up, basically, most of the time for all the big things. And I've read this account when Donald Tusk was the president. During the presidency, he was the the Council of the European Union, wasn't it?
Yes.
So he wrote an account of his 5 years in office, and in that, it's probably been translated into English, I would think, but I read it in Polish, and it describes this in the background, all the small countries have to meet up, and it's like give and take. They say, okay, we'll agree to this thing you're suggesting,
negotiation.
But in exchange, you will agree to what we're suggesting. And it was like toing and throwing until everybody was happy.
Well, that's what I mean. That's the European Union in a nutshell. But it's also the depiction that most people in this country never got close to, the complete misrepresentation. So you're right, and some of that misrepresentation continues. But yeah, I guess in an independence referendum or an independence campaign, people like you and others would be able to make that case clearly and explain in a way that never happened during the 2016 referendum what actually happened in Brussels, as opposed to what Nigel Farage says happens in Brussels. Thank you, Joanna. You made me a tiny bit late for this. It's the only reason I'm moving on. It is 10 to 1 and you're listening to James OBrien on LBC. I think... that can't be true, can it? I think that ludicrous barge in Portland is being evacuated after they found Legionella bacteria in the water. So one of the main reasons that organisations run by decent people were concerned, because if the accommodation is up to sniff, it doesn't matter whether the accommodation is on water or on land. But the concerns from campaigners and charities and caring human beings was that the accommodation wasn't safe. It wasn't up to sniff. So 30p Lennox essentially saying if you don't want, there was a report this morning about someone with tuberculosis being put on there, despite a doctor saying that would be absolutely disastrous. 30p Lennox then pops up to say, well, if you don't want to get tuberculosis, you can F off back to France. I'm just reading Sky News, a breaking story that the current residents of the racist barge are being removed from it after Legionella bacteria was found in the water supply. I mean, the phrase, I can't say the phrase, but like if you were to organise a drunken revel in a brewery, that phrase about not being able to organise a drunken revel in a brewery, it sits and fits this lot pretty neatly. Oh, dear. In fact, staying with politics, Dorries. It is now 63 days since Nadine Dorries, the former Secretary of State for Culture, Media and Sports, publicly pledged to resign as an MP with, and I quote, immediate effect, end quote. 63 days. Nadine Dorries is still an MP. Dorries. I don't think, Eleanor, I have never forgotten one, have I? I've never missed one, because you know how distracted I get, especially this late in the programme. But I've hit every Dorries on a Woke Watch talkover. I might have just timed it slightly wrong, but I've never missed one. Go me. And yet that story is true. Legionella bacteria, which can cause a serious type of lung infection known as Legionnaire's disease, has been found in the water on the Bibby Stockholm barge down in Dorset. All those on board are now likely to be taken to a new accommodation as a precautionary measure. 30p Lennox has yet to comment on this story, and wouldn't the world be a nicer place if, when he did, everybody just ignored him? 12:53 is the time, and I don't know. I'll squeeze in Andrea in Huntly, and then give you a little taste of this week's full disclosure. Because reading that Daily Telegraph report on how long it would take an independent Scotland to rejoin the EU, which drips with bias, it literally drips with bias and borderline disinformation. Dale Vince, the founder of Ecotricity and sort of all-round environmental hero, he's on Full Disclosure this week, and he has a cracking example of the media being well dodged as well, and he's obviously in a position to actually demand redress and get results, so I'll play that to you shortly. But first, Andrea is in Huntly. Andrea, back to the two unions. What would you like to say?
Hi there, James.
Hello.
Firstly, sadly, the Telegraph is one of many people, SMM, that are downgrading Scotland as just a bit player, I'm afraid. It happens all the time with the media. I actually agree with a great many of your other callers. I don't think there would be a hard border. I don't think there would be a hard border. I think actually England would be very scared of that. I also feel that a lot of the people I speak to, there's a lot of misinformation that goes on.
Well, I'm not surprised if they're publishing stuff like this in national newspapers. But
what I hear is, the SNP would just rule forever. People don't seem to understand that.
Yes, of course. Sorry, carry on.
You know, they don't understand that other political parties would reform as Scottish political parties, because at the moment the Tories and Labour are actually, they're not Scottish Tory or Scottish Labour, they're branch offices of England.
So what? Yes, of course. So people,
no such official Scottish thing other than the SNP. And I think, you know, if there's things with the SNP that you don't agree with, you think, well, they're just going to rule Scotland forever.
Yes.
And a lot of misinformation about that, or lack of understanding that actually we would rebuild.
You'd have a pluralist political system in the event of independence, but people who perhaps aren't warming to the SNP but are warm to the idea of independence are put off by the thought of the SNP or individual politicians being in power forever. Andrea, I'm moving on only so I can do a joke and play a clip from Full Disclosure. Apparently 30p Lennox Anderson has commented on news that the Legionella outbreak on the Bibby Stockholm has prompted an evacuation of all people aboard, and he's told Legionella to F off back to Liege, the Belgian town. It's quite a good joke, that, or not? Well, anyway, here's a little clip from this week's Full Disclosure where Dale Vince is talking to me about what it's like to catch yourself in the eye of a right-wing media storm. You've become, in the last few months, really, that you've achieved a strange prominence because you give to Extinction Rebellion, you've supported Just Stop Oil, and you also give to the Labour Party and have done for a long time. But you've been cast in by Conservative politicians and by right-wing newspapers as somehow, because you, tell me if I've got this right, Dale, because you give money to Keir Starmer and to Just Stop Oil, Just Stop Oil and you must therefore be writing Labour's environmental policies.
That is what they say.
That is what they say.
That is what they say. And it's
is it true?
Oh, it's so lame, actually. I mean, it began a month or two ago with the Daily Mail. They slapped this thing on the front page, basically making that claim. As if Starmer's policy on the North Sea was new, but he'd actually announced it a year earlier at Davos. You know, there's one thing that I happen to know, and I'm like, that makes the link even more tenuous. But I saw it as a desperate attempt to attack Labour with something.
Yes.
Because until that point, I think they'd had nothing, and of course there was a big gap in the polls and stuff like that. Bless them, the Sun. Right, the Sun doubled down like they do. I was on the Today programme and I answered a question honestly, which I always do. They said to me, "When did you last speak to Keir Starmer?" And I said, actually, it was last week. We had a 5-minute phone chat. And so the Sun splashed a headline saying, "Secret meeting unveiled." I'm like, hang on a minute.
Secret, you talked about it on the radio.
6 million listeners. And it was a chat on the phone. It wasn't a meeting. Anyway, they've rescinded that now. We had to challenge them and they've changed the headline. But
Really?
Yeah.
So that matters to you?
It does, yeah. Accuracy matters, truth matters.
Because a lot of people in your position would think that's a par for the course. I just not water off a duck's back. It's an occupational hazard.
Yeah, no, I wouldn't allow it.
Really?
Yeah, but it's just wrong. I guess I care about injustice,
yes,
untruths, and that kind of stuff, and they have an impact on people, don't they?
Yeah.
There'll be, I don't know what the readership of the Sun is, but let's say there are millions of people that read that headline that a secret meeting was discovered between me and Keir Starmer, and they think, what they're saying about policy is probably true.
You're absolutely right. They're imputing a negative motive, aren't they? They're imputing a kind of. Well, a conspiracy.
Yeah, that's right. It's all part of the kind of mudslinging and building that picture. When the truth is, I've never spoken to Keir Starmer about North Sea oil policy.
Right.
Not once.
No. I think he just wanted to say thank you for an imminent donation.
That's what the phone call was about.
Yeah, that's
exactly right. And when I said that, I thought, oh God, I've got to said too much now, because it was an imminent donation, not one that I'd already made. And I thought, now I'm telling you about something else, and you can focus on that, but it didn't come.
It's a really nice episode. That really covers his story. His personal story is astonishing. He spent about 15 years as what I would call a new age traveller. And then just built a windmill, and the next thing you know, he's a kind of sustainable energy millionaire. Although and just listen to it; it's really good. If you missed any of today's show, you can listen back on Catch Up on Global Player, where you can also rewind live radio. And lots of people are rewinding live radio, because I keep getting messages that are referring to something I did about 40 minutes ago. And I go, what are you doing that now? And I suddenly realise you've listened to Rewind Live Radio. You'll also find all LBC's shows there to catch up on, as well as the world's biggest podcast, including Full Disclosure with Dale Vince this week. Rewind Live Radio on Global Player. Download for free from your app store or head to globalplayer.com. Coming up at 4 on LBC, Ben Kentish is in for Tom Swarbrick once again, but now it's time for Sheila Fogarty. 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 It's time for Sheila Fogarty.